The Roman Republic of the 2nd century BCE stood as a colossus astride the Mediterranean world, its legions having crushed the great powers of antiquity one by one. Yet beneath the marble facades of Roman triumph lay a foundation built upon human misery, a vast network of slavery that permeated every aspect of society. By the time Spartacus would emerge from the gladiatorial schools of Capua, Rome had become utterly dependent on the labour of the enslaved, creating a powder keg of human desperation that would eventually explode into the most significant slave revolt in ancient history. The transformation of Rome from a modest Italian city-state into a Mediterranean empire brought with it an unprecedented influx of human chattel. The conquests of the 2nd century BCE, the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, the subjugation of Greece, the campaigns in Spain, and the wars against the Celtic tribes of Gaul flooded Roman markets with prisoners of war. Ancient sources suggest that after the siege of Carthage alone, over 50,000 survivors were sold into bondage. The sack of Corinth that same year added thousands more Greeks to the slave markets, while Roman campaigns in Spain and Gaul provided a steady stream of Celtic and Iberian captives. These prisoners of war represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Roman slavery. Unlike the household slaves of earlier periods, who were often integrated into Roman families and might expect eventual manumission, the new masses of enslaved peoples were treated as expendable commodities. They possessed no shared cultural bonds with their captors, spoke different languages, and worshipped foreign gods. To Romans, they were barbarians, whose sole purpose was to serve the expanding needs of the Republic's economy. The scale of this human trafficking defied comprehension. Conservative estimates suggest that by the late 2nd century BCE, slaves comprised between 30 and 40% of the population in central Italy, with even higher concentrations in certain regions. The island of Delos, which served as the primary slave market for the eastern Mediterranean, reportedly processed up to 10,000 slaves per day during peak periods. Roman merchants developed sophisticated networks for transporting, housing, and selling human beings, treating them with the same commercial efficiency they applied to grain or olive oil. The legal framework surrounding slavery reflected this commodification of human life. Under Roman law, slaves were classified as res mancipi, property that could be bought, sold, inherited, or destroyed at will. They possessed no legal rights, could not own property, and their testimony in court was only accepted under torture. Masters held the power of life and death over their slaves, and while some legal protections existed in theory, they were rarely enforced in practice. The Lex Aquilia allowed masters to kill slaves with impunity, provided they could demonstrate the slave had committed a serious offence. Within this brutal system, gladiatorial slaves occupied a unique and particularly horrific position. These men, and occasionally women, were purchased specifically to provide entertainment through mortal combat. The gladiatorial schools, known as ludi, operated as specialised training facilities where human beings were transformed into killing machines for public spectacle. The largest and most famous of these schools was located in Capua, about 120 miles southeast of Rome, where Spartacus himself would later train. The physical conditions within gladiatorial schools resembled military barracks crossed with prisons. Trainees were housed in small, cramped cells barely large enough for a sleeping mat and basic possessions. These quarters, excavated at sites like Pompeii, reveal spaces measuring roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, with thick walls and barred windows positioned too high to allow escape attempts. The cells were arranged around central courtyards where training took place, creating an environment of constant surveillance and control. Training regimens were designed to maximise combat effectiveness while breaking down individual identity and resistance. New arrivals underwent intensive physical conditioning, learning to wield various weapons including the gladius, trident, net, and different types of shields and armour. Trainers, themselves often former gladiators, employed brutal methods to instill discipline and eliminate any reluctance to kill. Trainees who showed hesitation or refused to fight faced severe punishment, including torture, starvation, or execution. The psychological impact of gladiatorial training was deliberately devastating. Men who had once been farmers, soldiers, or craftsmen were stripped of their former identities and rebuilt as entertainers, whose survival depended on their ability to kill other human beings. They were given stage names, assigned specific fighting styles based on their physical characteristics, and taught to perform for crowds that viewed their suffering as amusement. The constant proximity of death, combined with the knowledge that survival meant taking another's life, created a unique form of psychological torment that few could endure without profound mental damage. Gladiators were fed a specialized diet designed to build muscle mass and maintain health for combat. Archaeological evidence from gladiator cemeteries reveals that these men consumed large quantities of barley, beans, and dried fruit, along with calcium-rich supplements to strengthen bones. However, this relatively nutritious diet came at the cost of complete freedom and the certainty that death awaited in the arena. Medical care was provided not out of compassion but to protect the substantial financial investment each gladiator represented. The economic calculations surrounding gladiatorial combat were coldly precise. A trained gladiator represented a significant capital investment, often worth 2,000 to 6,000 denarii, enough to purchase a small farm or urban property. Gladiatorial school owners, known as lanistae, carefully managed their human assets to maximize profits while providing the spectacular violence that audiences demanded. The most successful gladiators could earn prize money and eventually purchase their freedom, but the vast majority died in the arena within 2 years of beginning their training. Beyond the specialized horror of gladiatorial schools, the broader Roman economy had become utterly dependent on slave labor across multiple sectors. In agriculture, massive slave-worked estates called latifundia dominated the countryside of central and southern Italy. These plantations, some encompassing thousands of acres, produced grain, wine, and olive oil using gangs of chained field hands who worked from dawn to dusk under the supervision of armed overseers. Agricultural slaves lived in underground barracks called ergastula, windowless stone buildings that were locked each night to prevent escape. These facilities, designed like prisons, housed dozens of workers in cramped, unsanitary conditions. The slaves were chained together during work hours and kept in leg irons even while sleeping. Their diet consisted primarily of bread, olives, and watered wine, just enough nutrition to maintain their capacity for labour. The mining operations that fed Rome's growing wealth presented perhaps the most brutal conditions of all. Silver mines in Spain, gold mines in Gaul, and marble quarries throughout the empire consumed thousands of slaves annually. These workers, often prisoners of war deemed too dangerous for other forms of labour, were literally worked to death in underground tunnels and open pits. Life expectancy in the mines rarely exceeded 2 years, leading to constant demand for fresh supplies of human labour. Urban slavery took different forms, but was no less pervasive. Wealthy Roman households employed dozens or even hundreds of slaves in specialized roles: cooks, cleaners, secretaries, tutors, entertainers, and bodyguards. These domestic slaves often enjoyed better living conditions than their rural counterparts, but they remained completely subject to their owners' whims. Sexual exploitation was commonplace, and household slaves could be sold, punished, or killed without legal recourse. The artisan workshops that produced goods for Rome's expanding markets also relied heavily on slave labour. Skilled craftsmen, potters, metal workers, textile producers, and builders were forced to train slave apprentices who would eventually replace free workers in many trades. This displacement of free labour created economic tensions that contributed to the social instability of the late Republic. The psychological and social effects of this slave-dependent economy extended far beyond the enslaved population itself. Free Romans, particularly those of modest means, found themselves competing with unpaid slave labour for employment opportunities. The concentration of land ownership in the hands of wealthy elites who could afford large slave workforces displaced small farmers, forcing them to migrate to cities where they swelled the ranks of the urban poor. This massive slave system had not emerged without resistance. Two major slave revolts in Sicily during the 2nd century BCE had demonstrated both the potential for large-scale uprising and the lengths to which Rome would go to suppress such challenges to the social order. The First Servile War erupted in 135 BCE, when a Syrian slave named Eunice convinced fellow slaves that the gods had chosen him to lead them to freedom. Beginning with a revolt on the estates around Enna in central Sicily, the uprising spread rapidly across the island. Eunice, who took the royal name Antiochus, proved to be a charismatic leader capable of organising disparate groups of slaves into an effective fighting force. The rebels captured several Sicilian cities, established their own government, and successfully resisted Roman military efforts for over 3 years. At its height, the slave army numbered perhaps 70,000 fighters drawn from the island's massive agricultural estates. The Roman response revealed both the threat such revolts posed and the resources the Republic could mobilise to crush them. Multiple consular armies were dispatched to Sicily, and the conflict required sustained military effort before the rebels were finally defeated in 132 BCE. The suppression was marked by extreme brutality. Thousands of captured rebels were crucified, and survivors were sold to gladiatorial schools or sent to work in mines. The Second Servile War began in 104 BCE under similar circumstances, led by a slave named Salvius, who also claimed divine sanction for rebellion. This revolt, while smaller in scale than its predecessor, again demonstrated the explosive potential of slave unrest when combined with effective leadership and favourable circumstances. Like the first revolt, it required years of sustained military effort to suppress and ended with mass executions and crucifixions. These Sicilian revolts established crucial precedents for understanding slave resistance in the Roman world. They demonstrated that enslaved populations, despite their diverse origins and languages, could unite under charismatic leadership when conditions became unbearable. The revolts also revealed that slaves could effectively organise military resistance, capture territory, and sustain organised opposition to Roman power for extended periods. The Roman response to these uprisings established patterns that would be repeated during Spartacus's revolt. Military commanders who failed to quickly suppress slave revolts faced political disgrace, while successful suppression brought glory and advancement. The extreme brutality of the final punishment, mass crucifixion, was designed not only to eliminate rebels, but to terrorize other slaves into submission. The economic disruption caused by these revolts also highlighted Rome's dangerous dependence on slave labor. Sicily served as one of Rome's primary sources of grain, and the revolts created food shortages that threatened political stability in the capital. This economic vulnerability would become even more pronounced by the time of Spartacus's revolt, as the Roman economy had grown even more dependent on enslaved labour across all sectors. By the 70s BCE, when Spartacus would emerge from the gladiatorial schools of Capua, the Roman Republic had created a society more dependent on slave labour than perhaps any civilization in human history. The massive influx of prisoners from Rome's conquests had created a vast underclass of the enslaved, who outnumbered free citizens in many regions. The brutal conditions of their bondage, combined with the precedent of successful large-scale revolts, had created the conditions for an explosion that would shake the Roman world to its foundations. The man who would become history's most famous rebel slave began life as a free warrior among the Thracian tribes of southeastern Europe. Spartacus belonged to the Maedi, one of the most warlike tribes inhabiting the rugged mountains and valleys between the Aegean Sea and the Danube River. This region, known to Romans as Thracia, produced some of the ancient world's most feared fighters. men who combined natural ferocity with sophisticated military tactics learned through generations of tribal warfare. Thracian society revolved around warrior culture, where status was earned through combat prowess and leadership in battle. The Maedi, like other Thracian tribes, organised themselves into clan-based military units led by chieftains, who had proven themselves in raids against neighbouring peoples. Archaeological evidence from Thracian burial sites reveals a society that prized martial skills above all else. Graves contain elaborate weapons, armour, and horse equipment that demonstrate both the wealth and military sophistication of these tribal warriors. The Thracians had developed distinctive fighting techniques that would later serve Spartacus well in his gladiatorial career and rebellion. They favoured curved swords called sika, small round shields, and javelins designed for both mounted and infantry combat. Thracian warriors were renowned for their mobility, using hit-and-run tactics that frustrated the more rigid formations preferred by Mediterranean armies. They painted their bodies with intricate designs before battle, believing these markings provided supernatural protection and intimidated enemies. Spartacus likely participated in the complex web of tribal conflicts that characterized Thracian politics during the early 1st century BCE. The region was divided among dozens of competing tribes, the Odomanti, Bessi, Dii, and others, who alternately fought each other and formed temporary alliances against external threats. Roman sources describe Thracian warriors as exceptionally brave but undisciplined, prone to individual acts of heroism that sometimes compromise larger tactical objectives. The circumstances of Spartacus's capture remain partially obscured by conflicting ancient accounts, but the most reliable sources suggest he was taken prisoner during one of Rome's periodic campaigns to secure the Thracian frontier. Roman expansion into the Balkans during the 2nd and early 1st centuries BCE brought legions into repeated conflict with Thracian tribes who resisted incorporation into the growing empire. These campaigns were characterized by extreme brutality on both sides, with Roman commanders seeking not just military victory, but the complete subjugation of tribal society. Marcus Licinius conducted a particularly devastating campaign against the Thracians in 71 BCE, though Spartacus was likely captured in an earlier operation. Roman military tactics in Thrace involved systematic destruction of tribal settlements, seizure of livestock and crops, and mass enslavement of captured warriors and their families. The mountainous terrain made conventional pitched battles rare, instead producing a series of ambushes, sieges of fortified positions, and running fights that could last for months. Thracian warriors captured in these campaigns faced a grim fate. Unlike prisoners taken in more conventional wars, who might be ransomed or incorporated into Roman auxiliary units, Thracians were considered too dangerous for normal slavery. Their reputation for fierce independence and skill in combat made them unsuitable for agricultural or domestic work, where they might organise resistance or escape attempts. Instead, the most formidable Thracian captives were sold to gladiatorial schools, where their fighting skills could be channeled into profitable entertainment. The journey from the Thracian mountains to the gladiatorial school at Capua represented a complete transformation of identity and circumstance. Spartacus, who had once led raids as a free warrior, found himself chained in a slave coffle marching hundreds of miles to his new prison. The psychological impact of this transition cannot be overstated. From respected tribal leader to human commodity, from fighting for clan honour to performing for Roman amusement. Capua, located in the fertile Campanian plain south of Rome, had become the centre of gladiatorial training by the 1st century BCE. The city's strategic location, midway between Rome and the Greek cities of southern Italy, made it an ideal hub for the gladiatorial industry. Wealthy Romans could easily travel to Capua to purchase trained fighters, while the surrounding countryside provided ample space for the large training facilities required to house and drill hundreds of gladiators. The gladiatorial school owned by Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus represented the pinnacle of this industry. Batiatus came from a family of Lanistae who had built their fortune on human combat, operating multiple facilities throughout Campania. His school in Capua housed approximately 200 gladiators at any given time, making it one of the largest such establishments in the Roman world. The facility occupied several acres, with training grounds, living quarters, workshops for weapon and armour maintenance, and medical facilities all enclosed within high stone walls topped with iron spikes. The physical layout of Batiatus's school reflected the dual nature of gladiatorial training, part military barracks, part prison. The central courtyard where most training took place measured roughly 100 feet square and was surrounded by covered porticos that provided shade during the intense heat of Campanian summers. Training equipment included wooden posts for sword practice, sand-filled dummies for spear work, and various types of practice weapons designed to build strength and technique without causing serious injury during training. Living quarters consisted of small cells arranged in blocks around secondary courtyards. Each cell, barely large enough for a sleeping mat and personal possessions, housed 2 gladiators who were often paired based on their fighting styles or ethnic backgrounds. The cells had thick stone walls, small barred windows set high above head level, and heavy wooden doors that were locked each night. Sanitation facilities were communal and primitive, consisting of simple latrines that drained into channels running beneath the complex. The hierarchy within Batiatus's school reflected both the commercial nature of gladiatorial training and the diverse backgrounds of the trainees. At the top stood the lanista himself, who made all major decisions about training, matches and discipline. Below him were the trainers, typically former gladiators who had earned their freedom and chose to remain in the business that had defined their lives. These instructors specialized in different fighting styles and weapons, passing on techniques that had kept them alive in the arena. Among the gladiators themselves, status depended on experience, skill and success in the arena. Veterans who had survived multiple combats commanded respect from newer arrivals and often received better food, equipment and living conditions. The most successful gladiators might be granted small privileges, better cells, occasional visits to local taverns under guard, or the right to keep a portion of prize money earned in the arena. Spartacus entered this world as a tiro, the lowest category of gladiator trainee. Despite his military experience as a Thracian warrior, he had to learn entirely new fighting techniques suited to arena combat. Gladiatorial fighting differed fundamentally from battlefield warfare. It was designed to provide entertainment rather than achieve military objectives, emphasizing individual skill and dramatic presentation over tactical coordination. The training regimen was deliberately brutal, designed to break down recruits' previous identities and rebuild them as entertainers, whose survival depended on their ability to kill efficiently and spectacularly. New arrivals underwent intensive physical conditioning that began before dawn and continued until sunset. They learned to use unfamiliar weapons, fight in restrictive armour, and perform for crowds that viewed their suffering as amusement. Spartacus was likely trained in the Thracian fighting style, which capitalized on his ethnic background and natural skills. Thracian gladiators wore distinctive equipment that included a wide-brimmed helmet with griffin crests, small rectangular shields, and curved swords similar to those used by actual Thracian warriors. This fighting style emphasized mobility and deception, using feints and quick strikes to overcome opponents who might have superior armor or reach. The psychological transformation required to become a gladiator was perhaps more challenging than the physical training. Men who had once fought for honor, homeland or survival now had to perform violence for the entertainment of their captors. The constant proximity of death, combined with the knowledge that survival meant taking another's life, created unique psychological pressures that few could endure without profound changes to their personality and worldview. Among Spartacus's fellow trainees at Batitus's school were men from across the Roman world, each bringing their own cultural background and military experience to the deadly profession. Crassus, a Gaul from the Allobroges tribe of southeastern France, had been captured during one of Rome's campaigns in Transalpine Gaul. Like Spartacus, he had been a warrior in his homeland, leading raids against rival tribes and Roman settlements along the frontier. Crassus possessed the physical attributes that made Gallic warriors feared throughout Europe, standing well over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and muscled frame typical of Celtic fighters. His reddish hair and pale skin marked him as a barbarian in Roman eyes, but his intelligence and natural leadership abilities quickly earned him respect among his fellow gladiators. Crassus was trained as a murmillo, a heavy gladiator who fought with sword and large shield, relying on strength and endurance rather than speed and agility. The relationship between Spartacus and Crassus would prove crucial to the coming rebellion, though their different backgrounds and fighting styles initially created tension. Thracians and Gauls had been enemies in their homelands, and the artificial environment of the gladiatorial school did little to overcome centuries of tribal animosity. However, their shared experience of capture, enslavement, and forced participation in mortal combat gradually created bonds stronger than ethnic rivalry. Eunomaus, another Gaul who had become one of Spartacus's key lieutenants, came from the Cimbri tribe of northern Europe. His people had migrated southward during the late 2nd century BCE, clashing with Roman forces in a series of devastating battles that had ended with their complete defeat and enslavement. Eunomaus had been a child during these conflicts, but had grown up hearing stories of his people's former freedom and the betrayals that led to their subjugation. Unlike the imposing Crassus, Eunomaus was smaller and more agile, trained as a retiarius who fought with trident and net. This fighting style required exceptional timing and coordination, using the weighted net to entangle opponents before finishing them with the 3-pronged spear. Retiarii were often viewed as less honourable than other gladiator types because they fought without armour and relied on what Romans considered cowardly tactics. But successful net fighters were among the most skilled athletes in the arena. The gladiatorial school also housed fighters from other conquered peoples, Germans captured during campaigns along the Rhine frontier, Numidians from North Africa, Greeks taken during various eastern campaigns, and even a few Romans who'd been enslaved for debt or criminal activity. This diversity created complex social dynamics within the school, as men who might have been enemies in their homelands found themselves training and living together under Roman domination. Communication among these diverse groups was facilitated by the gradual adoption of Latin as a common language, though many gladiators retained their native tongues for private conversations. The shared experience of enslavement and the constant threat of death in the arena created bonds that transcended ethnic divisions, though tensions based on homeland rivalries never completely disappeared. The daily routine at Batitus's school was rigidly structured to maximize training efficiency while maintaining discipline. Gladiators rose before dawn for a meal of barley porridge, beans and dried fruit, a diet designed to build muscle mass and maintain health for combat. Morning training focused on individual weapon work, with each gladiator practicing the techniques specific to his fighting style under the supervision of specialized instructors. Afternoon sessions involved sparring with practice weapons, conditioning exercises, and group drills that taught gladiators to fight effectively in the various combinations that might be required for arena spectacles. Some contests featured individual combat between matched opponents, while others involved group battles or elaborate staged hunts involving wild animals. Medical care was provided not out of concern for the gladiators' welfare, but to protect the substantial financial investment each represented. A trained gladiator could be worth several thousand denarii, making proper medical attention a business necessity. The school employed doctors who specialized in treating combat injuries, setting broken bones, and maintaining the fighter's health between matches. Despite the relatively good food and medical care, life in the gladiatorial school was marked by constant tension and the ever-present threat of death. Gladiators who showed reluctance to fight or attempted escape faced severe punishment, including torture, starvation, or immediate execution. The psychological pressure of knowing that survival depended on one's ability to kill other human beings for entertainment created a unique form of mental torment that few could endure without lasting damage. The treatment of gladiators by their owners and trainers varied considerably based on their value and potential. Promising fighters who showed skill and crowd appeal received better treatment, while those deemed less valuable faced harsher conditions and more dangerous assignments. Batiatus, like other successful lanistae, understood that his profits depended on maintaining a stable of skilled fighters who could provide entertaining spectacles without dying too quickly. However, the fundamental contradiction of the gladiatorial system, treating human beings as both valuable investments and expendable entertainment, created inherent instability. Gladiators were expected to fight with desperate courage while accepting their status as slaves, to develop martial skills while remaining submissive to their owners, and to form bonds with fellow fighters they might be forced to kill in the arena. The breaking point came in 73 BCE, when approximately 70 gladiators at Batiatus's school began planning a desperate escape attempt. The immediate triggers for this conspiracy included several factors that had made life in the school increasingly unbearable. Batiatus had recently increased the frequency of matches to meet growing demand from Roman audiences, forcing gladiators to fight more often with less time to recover from injuries. More importantly, several experienced gladiators who'd been promised manumission after completing a certain number of victories found their freedom indefinitely postponed. Roman law theoretically protected slaves from such breaches of contract, but gladiators had no practical recourse when their owners decided to extend their terms of service. The realization that freedom might never come, regardless of success in the arena, destroyed the last hope that had sustained many fighters through years of brutal training and mortal combat. The final spark that ignited the conspiracy was Batiatus's decision to force several pairs of gladiators to fight to the death in matches where both fighters were popular with crowds and valuable to the school. These contests, designed to provide maximum entertainment value, represented a particularly cruel form of exploitation that turned friendship and mutual respect into instruments of profit. The conspiracy began with quiet conversations among the most trusted and experienced gladiators, gradually expanding to include men from different ethnic backgrounds and fighting styles. Spartacus emerged as a natural leader for this group, combining his experience as a Thracian warrior with the respect he had earned through success in the arena. His ability to communicate with fighters from different backgrounds and his reputation for both courage and intelligence made him an ideal focal point for the growing rebellion. The conspirators faced enormous challenges in planning their escape. The school was heavily guarded, with armed overseers maintaining constant surveillance during training hours and the gladiators locked in their cells each night. Any attempt to break out would require careful coordination, access to real weapons instead of practice equipment, and a plan for what to do after escaping the immediate confines of the school. The gladiators' knowledge of the surrounding countryside was limited, as they were rarely allowed outside the school, except when travelling to arena matches under heavy guard. They knew that Capua was surrounded by Roman settlements and military installations, making immediate escape from the region extremely difficult. However, their desperation had reached the point where even a slim chance of freedom seemed preferable to the certainty of death in the arena. The conspiracy that had been fermenting within the walls of Batiatus's gladiatorial school reached its critical moment in the spring of 73 BCE, when the daily routine of enforced combat training would be shattered by an act of desperate courage that would reshape the Roman world. The planning phase had consumed weeks of careful preparation, with Spartacus and his core group of conspirators using every moment of apparent normalcy to refine their escape strategy and recruit additional fighters to their cause. The gladiators had identified several crucial weaknesses in the school's security arrangements that could be exploited during their breakout attempt. The facility's guards, while numerous, had grown complacent after years of managing what they perceived as broken men whose spirits had been crushed by arena combat. The overseers maintained strict discipline during training hours, but relaxed their vigilance during meal periods, when gladiators were permitted to move more freely within the common areas of the complex. Spartacus recognized that timing would be absolutely critical to the success of their escape attempt. The conspirators needed to act when the maximum number of gladiators would be present in the school, ensuring they could recruit as many fighters as possible once the breakout began. They also required access to the kitchen areas where real knives and other potential weapons were stored, rather than the blunted practice equipment used during training sessions. The signal for action came during the midday meal on what appeared to be an ordinary day in the late spring of 73 BCE. Approximately 70 gladiators had committed to participating in the escape attempt, though many others remained unaware of the conspiracy until violence erupted around them. The rebels had agreed that once fighting began, there could be no hesitation or retreat. Success depended on overwhelming the guards through sheer audacity and coordinated action. The initial phase of the breakout unfolded with stunning swiftness and brutality. Spartacus and several other conspirators had positioned themselves near the kitchen complex during the meal period, ostensibly engaged in normal conversation while actually preparing to seize control of the food preparation area. At the predetermined moment, they rushed the kitchen staff and guards, overpowering them before any alarm could be raised. The kitchen complex yielded a treasure trove of improvised weapons that the gladiators desperately needed to arm themselves for the fight ahead. Long carving knives designed for butchering meat became deadly short swords in the hands of men trained in close combat. Heavy cleavers provided brutal chopping weapons that could shatter bones and sever limbs with devastating effect. Iron skewers used for roasting became makeshift spears, while wooden handles from various utensils could serve as clubs or throwing weapons. The rebels also seized large quantities of kitchen implements that could serve secondary purposes during their escape. Heavy iron pots became improvised helmets or shields, while leather aprons provided minimal protection against blade strikes. Ropes used for securing provisions were quickly appropriated for binding captured guards or scaling walls during the breakout. With weapons secured, the conspirators moved rapidly to neutralize the school's guard force before organized resistance could develop. The gladiators possessed several crucial advantages in this phase of the fighting. They knew the layout of the facility intimately. They had trained together for months or years and could coordinate their movements effectively, and their desperation gave them a ferocity that their opponents could not match. The guards, caught completely off guard by the sudden eruption of violence, found themselves facing opponents whose combat skills far exceeded their own. Most of the overseers were former soldiers or hired thugs, whose primary qualifications were physical strength and willingness to use violence against unarmed slaves. They had never expected to face gladiators armed with real weapons and fighting for their lives. The rebels systematically worked their way through the school complex, overwhelming guard posts and freeing gladiators who had not been part of the original conspiracy. Many of these newly liberated fighters immediately joined the escape attempt, swelling the rebel numbers and providing additional combat expertise. The psychological impact of seeing their fellow gladiators fighting successfully against their captors proved enormously motivating for men who had long believed escape was impossible. Crassus distinguished himself during this phase of the breakout, using his imposing physical presence and combat skills to devastating effect against the school's guards. His experience as a murmillo gladiator had trained him to fight effectively with improvised weapons and minimal armor, skills that proved invaluable during the chaotic close-quarters combat that characterized the escape attempt. The tall Gaul's natural leadership abilities also helped coordinate the actions of newly freed gladiators who might otherwise have acted independently. Oenomaus contributed his own specialised skills to the rebel effort, using his agility and experience as a retiarius to outmaneuver guards in the confined spaces of the school complex. His knowledge of unconventional fighting techniques proved particularly valuable when the rebels encountered locked doors or other obstacles that required creative solutions. The smaller Gauls' ability to squeeze through narrow openings and scale walls also helped the rebels access areas of the facility that might otherwise have remained secure. The systematic nature of the gladiators' assault on the school's defences reflected their military backgrounds and professional training. Rather than simply rushing toward the exits in a disorganised mob, the rebels methodically secured each section of the complex before moving forward. They disabled guards, seized additional weapons and supplies, and ensured that no enemy forces remained behind them that could threaten their retreat or raise alarms. The rebels encountered their most serious resistance when they reached the main gates of the school complex, where a larger contingent of guards had managed to organise a defensive position. These men, recognising that their lives depended on preventing the gladiators' escape, fought with desperate courage despite being outnumbered and outmatched in combat skills. The gate guards had access to proper military equipment, including swords, spears and shields, giving them significant advantages over rebels armed primarily with kitchen implements. The battle for control of the main gates developed into the most intense fighting of the entire breakout attempt. The confined space of the gateway created a natural choke point where the rebels' numerical superiority was partially negated, while the guards' superior equipment allowed them to inflict casualties despite their disadvantageous position. Several gladiators fell during this phase of the fighting, their deaths serving as grim reminders of the stakes involved in their desperate gamble for freedom. Spartacus personally led the final assault on the gate position, demonstrating the combat skills and tactical intelligence that had made him a successful arena fighter. He coordinated attacks from multiple directions, using some rebels to create diversions, while others flanked the defensive position. His ability to maintain tactical coherence during the chaos of close combat proved crucial to overcoming the guards' resistance and securing the rebels' escape route. The successful capture of the main gates marked the effective end of organised resistance within the gladiatorial school. The surviving guards either fled or surrendered, leaving the rebels in complete control of the facility and its resources. However, the gladiators understood that their escape from the school itself represented only the first phase of a much larger challenge. They now needed to evade capture by Roman military forces while building a sustainable rebellion. The rebels quickly organised themselves for immediate departure from Capua, recognising that Roman authorities would respond swiftly once news of the breakout reached local officials. They gathered whatever supplies they could carry, including food, additional weapons, and basic equipment that might prove useful during their flight. The gladiators also freed other slaves working in the school complex, swelling their numbers further and gaining valuable intelligence about the surrounding countryside. The choice of Mount Vesuvius as their initial destination reflected both practical military considerations and the symbolic significance of the location for their rebellion. The mountain, located approximately 20 miles southeast of Capua, offered several crucial advantages for a force of escaped slaves attempting to evade Roman pursuit. Its rugged terrain provided natural defensive positions that could be held by relatively small numbers of fighters against much larger conventional forces. The slopes of Vesuvius were covered with dense forests and rocky outcroppings that offered concealment from Roman search parties, while providing multiple escape routes if the rebels needed to disperse quickly. The mountain's elevation gave defenders clear views of the surrounding countryside, allowing them to spot approaching enemies from considerable distances. Natural caves and overhangs provided shelter from weather and temporary storage for supplies and equipment. The volcanic soil of Vesuvius supported abundant vegetation that could supplement the rebels' food supplies through foraging and hunting. Wild fruits, nuts, and edible plants grew throughout the mountainous region. while game animals provided opportunities for hunting parties to secure fresh meat. Natural springs supplied clean drinking water, eliminating the need to venture into populated areas where the rebels might be detected and reported to Roman authorities. The symbolic significance of Mount Vesuvius as a refuge for the oppressed resonated deeply with the diverse group of escaped slaves who comprised Spartacus's initial following. The mountain had long been associated in local folklore with resistance to Roman authority, serving as a hideout for bandits, deserters, and other outcasts who rejected imperial rule. Its imposing presence dominated the Campanian landscape, visible from Rome itself on clear days, making it a powerful symbol of defiance that could inspire others to join the rebellion. The rebels' march from Capua to Mount Vesuvius demonstrated their growing organizational capabilities and the magnetic appeal of their cause to other oppressed populations. As the column of escaped gladiators moved through the countryside, they were joined by increasing numbers of agricultural slaves who abandoned their masters' estates to seek freedom with the rebels. These new recruits brought valuable knowledge of local geography, supply sources, and the locations of potential sympathizers. The agricultural slaves who joined the rebellion represented a crucial expansion of the movement's social base beyond the specialized warrior culture of the gladiatorial schools. These men and women had different skills and backgrounds. They knew farming techniques, animal husbandry, and craft production that would prove essential for sustaining a large rebel force over extended periods. Their intimate knowledge of rural Campania also provided intelligence about Roman military installations, supply routes, and potential sources of weapons and equipment. Free peasants and displaced persons also began gravitating toward the rebel force as news of the successful escape spread throughout the region. These individuals, while not technically slaves, had been marginalized by Rome's increasingly unequal economic system and saw the rebellion as an opportunity to improve their circumstances. Their participation broadened the movement's appeal beyond the enslaved population and provided additional military manpower. The rapid growth of the rebel force from approximately 70 escaped gladiators to several thousand followers within weeks demonstrated both the widespread discontent among the oppressed populations of Campania and Spartacus's emerging skills as leader, capable of welding diverse groups into a cohesive fighting force. This expansion also created new challenges for the rebellion, as the leaders needed to develop systems for feeding, housing, and organizing much larger numbers of people than they had initially anticipated. The establishment of the rebel camp on Mount Vesuvius marked the beginning of a remarkable experiment in creating an alternative society based on principles fundamentally opposed to Roman social organization. Rather than simply seeking to escape Roman territory, Spartacus and his followers began developing the organizational structures necessary to sustain a permanent community of free people who had rejected imperial authority. The leadership structure that emerged during this period reflected both the military backgrounds of the core gladiator group and the diverse origins of the rebellion's growing membership. Spartacus assumed overall command of the rebel force, a position he had earned through his role in planning and executing the escape from Capua, as well as his demonstrated abilities as both warrior and organizer. His Thracian background provided him with military experience that proved invaluable in developing defensive strategies and training new recruits. Crixus and Oenomaus became Spartacus's primary lieutenants, each taking responsibility for specific aspects of the rebellion's operations. Crixus, with his imposing physical presence and natural charisma, proved particularly effective at recruiting and training new fighters from among the agricultural slaves and free peasants who joined the movement. His Gallic heritage also helped him connect with Celtic populations throughout central Italy who harboured resentments against Roman rule. Oenomaus assumed responsibility for intelligence gathering and communications, using his smaller stature and agility to lead scouting parties that monitored Roman military movements and identified potential sources of supplies and recruits. His experience with unconventional fighting techniques also made him valuable in training rebels who lacked formal military backgrounds in guerrilla warfare tactics. The rebel leadership established a military hierarchy that incorporated fighters from different backgrounds while maintaining the discipline necessary for effective combat operations. Former gladiators, with their professional combat training, formed the core of elite units that could be deployed in critical situations, requiring maximum fighting effectiveness. Agricultural slaves and other recruits received basic military training while contributing their specialized skills to the rebellion's logistical operations. The creation of a functioning rebel society required developing systems for resource allocation, dispute resolution, and decision-making that could accommodate the diverse cultural backgrounds and expectations of the movement's membership. The leaders needed to balance the warrior ethos of the gladiator corps with the more egalitarian expectations of escaped agricultural slaves, while also incorporating free peasants who had different concepts of authority and social organization. The rebels established workshops for weapon and equipment production, utilizing the metalworking and crafting skills of former artisan slaves to manufacture spears, swords, and armor from captured materials and scavenged metal. These production facilities became crucial to the rebellion's military effectiveness, allowing the leaders to arm new recruits and replace equipment lost or damaged in combat operations. Food production and distribution systems were organized around foraging parties that gathered wild foods from the mountainous terrain, hunting groups that secured fresh meat, and agricultural specialists who identified opportunities for raiding Roman supply convoys or capturing livestock from nearby estates. The rebels also established rudimentary medical facilities staffed by individuals with healing knowledge, recognizing that caring for wounded fighters was essential to maintaining morale and combat effectiveness. The rebel society that emerged on Mount Vesuvius represented a remarkable achievement in alternative social organization, demonstrating that escaped slaves and other marginalized populations could create functional communities based on principles of mutual cooperation and shared resistance to Roman authority. This experiment in freedom would soon face its first major test as Roman military forces began organizing systematic campaigns to crush the rebellion and restore imperial control over the region. The news of the gladiatorial breakout at Capua reached Roman authorities with the speed of wildfire, carried by terrified guards who had escaped the carnage and local citizens who witnessed the rebels' march towards Mount Vesuvius. The initial report seemed almost impossible to believe. A handful of arena fighters had somehow overwhelmed professional guards, liberated an entire gladiatorial school, and were now gathering followers in the Campanian countryside. For Roman officials accustomed to viewing slaves as broken property incapable of organized resistance, the very concept of armed gladiators operating freely represented a fundamental challenge to their understanding of social order. The Senate's response reflected both the gravity of the situation and the political complexities of the late Republic. Slave revolts fell under the jurisdiction of praetors, magistrates responsible for maintaining internal security and administering justice within Roman territories. The assignment of military commands against rebellious slaves carried significant political implications. A successful suppression could enhance a commander's reputation, while failure might destroy careers and political ambitions. Gaius Claudius Glaber received the commission to crush what Roman authorities still considered a minor disturbance that could be resolved through swift military action. Glaber came from a prominent plebeian family with a long history of military service, and his appointment reflected the Senate's confidence that conventional Roman tactics would quickly overwhelm the escaped slaves. The praetor possessed extensive experience in provincial administration and had served with distinction during various frontier campaigns, qualifications that seemed more than adequate for dealing with what appeared to be a localized security problem. Glaber's military resources for the campaign included approximately 3,000 legionary troops drawn from garrisons throughout Campania, supplemented by auxiliary units and local militia forces. This represented a substantial force by the standards of internal security operations, roughly equivalent to a reinforced legion, with supporting elements. The troops were well equipped with standard Roman military gear, including iron-tipped javelins, short swords, rectangular shields, and segmented armour that provided excellent protection against most weapons likely to be encountered in combat against escaped slaves. The Roman force also included significant numbers of cavalry units recruited from Italian allied communities, providing mobility and reconnaissance capabilities that would prove crucial for operations in the mountainous terrain around Vesuvius. These mounted troops carried longer spears designed for charging enemy formations, along with swords for close combat and composite bows for engaging targets at extended ranges. Their horses were bred specifically for military service, trained to remain calm during battle and capable of carrying armoured riders across difficult terrain. Glaber's strategic approach to the campaign reflected standard Roman military doctrine for dealing with irregular opponents in mountainous terrain. Rather than attempting to storm the rebel positions directly, which would have required costly frontal assaults against defenders holding advantageous ground, the praetor decided to implement a siege strategy designed to starve the rebels into submission while minimizing Roman casualties. The siege of Mount Vesuvius began in earnest during the summer of 73 BCE, with Roman forces establishing fortified camps at strategic locations around the mountain's base. These positions were carefully selected to control access roads, water sources, and other critical terrain features that the rebels might use to resupply their forces or communicate with potential supporters in the surrounding countryside. The Roman camps followed standard military engineering practices, with earthwork ramparts, wooden palisades, and defensive ditches that could protect the besieging forces while serving as bases for offensive operations. Glaber's siege lines incorporated sophisticated engineering works that demonstrated Roman expertise in military construction. The camps were connected by a network of trenches and fortified positions that created overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any rebel attempt to break through the encirclement would face concentrated resistance from multiple directions. Signal towers equipped with fire beacons and horn systems allowed rapid communication between different sections of the siege line, enabling coordinated responses to rebel activities. The Roman supply system for the siege operation functioned with characteristic efficiency, drawing resources from the agricultural wealth of Campania to sustain thousands of troops over extended periods. Supply convoys arrived regularly from Capua and other regional centres, carrying grain, wine, olive oil, and other provisions necessary to maintain military effectiveness. The Romans also established field hospitals, workshops for equipment maintenance, and administrative facilities that demonstrated their expectation of a prolonged campaign. From his command position, Glaber could observe the rebel encampment on the mountain slopes through the clear Mediterranean air that provided excellent visibility across the Campanian landscape. The Roman commander noted the rebels' defensive preparations, including the construction of crude fortifications and the organisation of guard posts that suggested a higher level of military sophistication than he had initially expected from escaped slaves. However, these observations only reinforced his confidence that the siege strategy would ultimately succeed. The rebels' position on Mount Vesuvius appeared to offer significant defensive advantages, but also contained inherent vulnerabilities that Roman military analysis had identified. The mountain's steep slopes and rocky terrain made direct assault extremely difficult, forcing attackers to advance uphill against defenders who could rain down projectiles and roll boulders onto advancing formations. The elevation also provided excellent observation points that allowed rebel lookouts to monitor Roman movements across the surrounding countryside. However, the rebels' defensive position suffered from critical weaknesses that Glaber expected to exploit through his siege strategy. The mountain's water sources were limited to a few springs that could potentially be controlled or contaminated by Roman forces. Food supplies depended entirely on foraging and hunting within the mountainous terrain, resources that would quickly become insufficient to support the growing rebel population. Most importantly, the rebels appeared to be trapped on the mountain with no viable escape routes that would not expose them to Roman attack. The psychological warfare aspects of the siege operation reflected Roman understanding of the mental pressures that could break enemy morale over time. The constant presence of Roman forces surrounding the mountain served as a visible reminder of imperial power and the futility of resistance against the Republic's military might. The regularity of Roman supply convoys demonstrated the besiegers' ability to maintain their operations indefinitely, while the rebels faced increasing shortages and hardships. Roman confidence in the siege strategy was reinforced by historical precedents from previous slave revolts in Sicily, where similar encirclement tactics had eventually forced rebel surrender despite initial setbacks. The commanders expected that hunger, thirst, and the psychological pressure of encirclement would gradually erode rebel cohesion and fighting spirit, leading to internal conflicts and eventual capitulation without the need for costly assault operations. However, Spartacus and his fellow rebel leaders possessed military experience and tactical intelligence that Roman authorities had seriously underestimated. The Thracian warrior's background included extensive knowledge of mountain warfare and unconventional tactics that had been developed through generations of tribal conflict in the rugged terrain of southeastern Europe. His understanding of guerrilla warfare principles would soon prove crucial to the rebels' survival and ultimate success against seemingly overwhelming odds. The rebel leadership conducted detailed reconnaissance of the Roman siege positions, using their intimate knowledge of the mountain's terrain to identify weaknesses in the encirclement that might be exploited. Small groups of scouts, led by men with hunting and tracking experience, mapped Roman patrol routes, supply lines, and communication systems while remaining undetected in the dense vegetation that covered much of Vesuvius's slopes. Spartacus recognized that the rebels' survival depended on breaking the psychological assumptions underlying Roman strategy. The siege was designed to work against passive defenders who would gradually weaken under pressure and eventually surrender. However, if the rebels could demonstrate their ability to strike back effectively against Roman forces, they might shatter the confidence that sustained the besiegers' morale while inspiring additional recruits to join their cause. The solution to the rebels' tactical dilemma came from careful observation of the terrain features that Roman military engineers had either overlooked or dismissed as impassable. The southern face of Mount Vesuvius featured a series of steep cliffs that appeared to offer no viable routes for human passage, leading Roman commanders to concentrate their forces on more accessible approaches while leaving the cliff areas lightly guarded or completely unmonitored. However, rebel scouts discovered that wild grapevines growing on the cliff face had created natural rope systems that could potentially support human weight if properly utilized. These vines, strengthened by years of growth in the volcanic soil, formed intricate networks that extended from the rebel positions down to areas beyond the Roman siege lines. The discovery of this potential escape route provided the foundation for a daring plan that would demonstrate the rebels' tactical innovation and military capabilities. The preparation for the cliff descent required careful planning and specialized knowledge that drew upon the diverse skills of the rebel community. Former agricultural slaves contributed their experience with rope work and plant cultivation, identifying the strongest vines and developing techniques for weaving them into more robust climbing aids. Gladiators provided the physical conditioning and courage necessary for the dangerous descent, while hunters and trackers mapped the terrain below the cliffs to identify optimal landing zones and escape routes. The rebels spent several days gathering and preparing the vine ropes that would be essential to their escape plan. The vines were carefully tested for strength and flexibility, with the strongest specimens selected for the most critical portions of the descent. Additional ropes were woven from available plant materials and strips of cloth to provide backup systems and extend the reach of the natural vine networks. The timing of the escape attempt was coordinated with Roman patrol schedules and guard rotations that rebel scouts had observed during their reconnaissance operations. The descent would begin during the darkest hours before dawn, when Roman visibility was most limited and the guards were likely to be least alert after long hours of monotonous duty. The rebels also planned to create diversions in other areas of their perimeter to draw Roman attention away from the cliff face during the critical phases of the operation. On the appointed night, approximately 70 of the most experienced fighters began the treacherous descent down the cliff face of Mount Vesuvius. Spartacus led the climbing party, demonstrating the personal courage and leadership by example that had earned him the loyalty of his followers. The Thracian warrior's experience with mountain terrain and his natural athletic abilities made him ideally suited for the dangerous descent, while his presence at the front of the climbing column provided reassurance to less experienced climbers. The descent proved even more challenging than the rebels had anticipated, with loose rock, tangled vegetation, and the constant threat of detection by Roman sentries, creating multiple hazards for the climbing party. Several rebels suffered injuries during the descent, including cuts from sharp rocks and strains from the physical demands of rope climbing in darkness. However, the group's determination and careful preparation enabled them to reach the base of the cliffs without triggering Roman alarms or losing any members to fatal accidents. Once the rebel strike force had successfully descended the cliff and regrouped at the base of the mountain, they began implementing the second phase of their plan, a surprise attack on the Roman siege camps designed to shatter enemy morale while demonstrating the rebels' continued military effectiveness. The attack would target the least defended sections of the Roman perimeter, using stealth and surprise to maximize impact while minimizing rebel casualties. The rebel force moved silently through the pre-dawn darkness, using their knowledge of local terrain to approach the Roman camps from unexpected directions. Their weapons remained primarily improvised implement seized during the escape from Capua, supplemented by tools and materials gathered during their time on Mount Vesuvius. However, their tactical advantages lay not in superior equipment but in motivation, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the terrain they were fighting to defend. The attack began with simultaneous assaults on multiple Roman positions, creating confusion and preventing coordinated defensive responses. Rebel fighters emerged from concealment at close range, overwhelming guard posts before alarms could be raised, and spreading panic through sections of the Roman camp. The rebels' gladiatorial training proved invaluable during the close-quarters combat that characterized the assault, as their skills with various weapons and their conditioning for sustained physical combat gave them significant advantages over regular legionary troops caught off guard. The psychological impact of the rebel attack exceeded even Spartacus's optimistic expectations, as Roman soldiers who had expected to be conducting a routine siege operation suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against opponents who had supposedly been trapped and helpless. The surprise and ferocity of the assault shattered Roman assumptions about slave capabilities and military effectiveness, creating panic that spread far beyond the immediate combat zones. Glaber's command structure collapsed under the pressure of the unexpected attack, as communications system failed and unit commanders struggled to assess the scope of the rebel assault while organising defensive responses. The Roman forces had been positioned for siege operations rather than defending against external attack, leaving them vulnerable to the kind of aggressive assault that the rebels had launched. Many Roman soldiers, awakened from sleep by the sounds of combat, emerged from their tents confused and disoriented, making them easy targets for rebel fighters who had planned their attack carefully. The rebels systematically worked their way through the Roman camps, seizing weapons, armour and supplies while eliminating organised resistance. The capture of Roman military equipment represented a crucial breakthrough for the rebellion, providing the rebels with professional quality weapons and protective gear that would significantly enhance their combat effectiveness in future engagements. Swords, spears, shields, and armour taken from defeated Roman troops would equip rebel fighters with the tools necessary to face imperial forces on more equal terms. The collapse of Roman resistance during the night attack demonstrated the effectiveness of unconventional tactics against conventional military forces that had not prepared for the type of warfare the rebels were capable of conducting. Glaber's troops, trained for pitched battles and siege operations, proved vulnerable to the surprise attacks and close-quarters combat that characterized gladiatorial fighting techniques adapted for military purposes. As dawn broke over the Campanian countryside, the full extent of the Roman disaster became apparent to surviving imperial forces and local observers. The siege camps lay in ruins, with equipment scattered across the battlefield and the bodies of Roman soldiers testament to the rebels' fighting capabilities. Glaber himself had been forced to flee the field, abandoning his command and leaving his surviving troops to retreat in disorder toward the safety of fortified towns. The victory at Mount Vesuvius transformed the character of the slave rebellion from a localized security problem into a genuine military threat that demanded serious attention from Roman authorities. News of Glaber's defeat spread rapidly throughout Italy, carried by fleeing soldiers, terrified civilians, and the efficient communication networks that connected Roman administrative centres. The report seemed almost impossible to believe. A force of escaped slaves had not only survived a professional military siege, but had actually defeated a Praetorian army in open combat. The psychological impact of the rebel victory extended far beyond the immediate military consequences, striking at fundamental assumptions about Roman invincibility and social order that sustained imperial authority throughout the Mediterranean world. If slaves could defeat Roman legions, what did that mean for the stability of a society built upon the systematic exploitation of enslaved populations? The victory demonstrated that the oppressed possessed both the capability and the will to resist their masters through organized violence, inspiring fear among slave owners while encouraging resistance among the enslaved. The aftermath of Glaber's defeat saw a dramatic expansion in the rebel movement as thousands of additional slaves abandoned their masters' estates to join what now appeared to be a viable path to freedom. Agricultural workers throughout Campania and the surrounding regions left their fields and workshops, swelling the rebel ranks with recruits who brought diverse skills and local knowledge. The rebellion was no longer confined to escaped gladiators, but had become a broad-based movement that attracted support from multiple segments of the oppressed population. The Roman Senate's response to this escalating crisis reflected both the gravity of the military situation and the political complexities that surrounded any response to slave rebellion. The defeat of a Praetorian army required immediate action to restore imperial prestige and prevent further expansion of the revolt, but the assignment of additional military commands carried significant political risks for commanders who might face similar defeats. Publius Varinius received the commission to succeed Glaber in command of operations against the rebels, bringing with him reinforcements and a mandate to restore Roman authority in Campania through whatever means necessary. Varinius possessed extensive military experience and had served with distinction in various provincial campaigns, qualifications that seemed to provide better prospects for success than his predecessor's failed siege strategy. However, the rebel forces that Varinius would face bore little resemblance to the desperate fugitives who had escaped from Capua months earlier. The victory over Glaber had provided the rebels with professional military equipment, tactical experience against Roman forces, and most importantly, the confidence that came from proven success against seemingly overwhelming odds. Spartacus and his followers had evolved from escaped slaves into a formidable military organization capable of challenging Roman power on equal terms. The transformation of Spartacus's rebel force from a desperate band of escaped gladiators into a sophisticated military organization represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of ancient warfare. Following their stunning victory over Glaber's forces at Mount Vesuvius, the rebels faced the monumental challenge of organizing thousands of new recruits from diverse backgrounds into an effective fighting force capable of sustaining prolonged resistance against the Roman Republic's military might. The organisational structure that emerged during the winter of 73-72 BCE reflected both Spartacus's strategic vision and the practical necessities of managing an army that had grown from 70 gladiators to an estimated 40,000 followers within months of the initial breakout. The Thracian commander recognised that the rebellion's continued success depended on creating military units that could harness the diverse skills and cultural backgrounds of his followers while maintaining the discipline necessary for effective combat operations against professional Roman forces. The ethnic composition of the rebel army created both opportunities and challenges for the leadership. Thracians formed the core of the officer corps, drawing upon their tribal military traditions and natural affinity for their commander. These warriors brought sophisticated knowledge of mountain warfare, cavalry tactics, and the psychological aspects of combat that had been refined through generations of conflict in the Balkans. Their experience with hit-and-run tactics and unconventional warfare proved invaluable in developing strategies that could exploit Roman tactical rigidity. Gallic contingents represented the largest single ethnic group within the rebel forces, comprising former warriors from various Celtic tribes who had been enslaved during Rome's campaigns in Transalpine Gaul. These men possessed extensive experience with large-scale warfare, having participated in the complex tribal conflicts that characterized Celtic society. Their knowledge of formation fighting, siege warfare, and cavalry operations provided crucial expertise that complemented the Thracian emphasis on irregular tactics. The Gallic warriors also brought sophisticated metalworking skills that proved essential for weapon production and equipment maintenance. Celtic smiths had developed advanced techniques for producing high-quality iron weapons and armour, knowledge that became invaluable as the rebels established workshops to arm their growing forces. The distinctive Celtic sword designs, with their longer blades and superior balance, offered significant advantages over the improvised weapons that had initially armed the rebel forces. Germanic fighters contributed their own specialised military knowledge, including expertise in forest warfare and the construction of fortified positions using available timber and earthwork materials. These warriors had extensive experience fighting Roman forces along the Rhine frontier, providing tactical intelligence about legionary formations, equipment, and standard operating procedures. Their knowledge of Roman military engineering also proved valuable in developing countermeasures against siege operations and fortified positions. Spartacus implemented a military hierarchy that incorporated these diverse ethnic groups while maintaining overall unity of command. Thracian officers typically commanded mixed units that included fighters from multiple backgrounds, ensuring that tribal loyalties did not undermine broader military objectives. This integration strategy also facilitated the sharing of tactical knowledge and combat techniques between different groups, creating a more versatile fighting force than would have been possible with ethnically segregated units. The weapon procurement program developed by the rebel leadership demonstrated remarkable innovation and organizational sophistication. Beyond the equipment captured from defeated Roman forces, the rebels established systematic production facilities that could manufacture weapons and armour using materials obtained through raids, trade, and local resource exploitation. Captured Roman smiths and artisans, many of whom joined the rebellion voluntarily after witnessing rebel victories, provided technical expertise that significantly enhanced production capabilities. The rebels' weapons workshops operated according to standardized designs that balanced effectiveness with production efficiency. Spear points were forged using simplified techniques that allowed relatively inexperienced smiths to produce serviceable weapons in large quantities. Sword production focused on practical designs that could be manufactured using available materials while providing adequate performance in combat. Shield construction utilized locally available wood and leather, reinforced with metal fittings salvaged from various sources. Armour production presented greater challenges due to the specialised skills and materials required for effective protective equipment. The rebels developed innovative solutions that combined captured Roman armour components with locally produced elements, creating hybrid designs that provided reasonable protection while remaining feasible to manufacture in field conditions. Leather armour reinforced with metal scales or plates became standard equipment for many rebel fighters, offering mobility and protection suited to their tactical requirements. The establishment of supply lines represented perhaps the most crucial aspect of the rebels' organisational development. Traditional military forces relied on established logistics networks that could provide regular supplies of food, equipment, and other necessities. The rebel army faced the unique challenge of sustaining large numbers of fighters while operating in hostile territory without access to conventional supply systems. Spartacus addressed this challenge through a combination of systematic foraging, strategic raiding, and the development of mobile supply networks that could adapt to changing tactical situations. Foraging parties operated according to carefully planned schedules that maximised resource collection while minimising exposure to Roman counterattacks. These units included specialists with extensive knowledge of local geography, seasonal food sources, and the locations of stored supplies that could be requisitioned for rebel use. The raiding program targeted Roman supply convoys, military depots, and civilian settlements that could provide equipment and provisions for the rebel forces. These operations were conducted with military precision, using intelligence gathered by scout networks to identify valuable targets while avoiding heavily defended positions that might result in unnecessary casualties. The rebels developed specialised tactics for convoy ambushes that maximised capture of supplies while allowing rapid withdrawal before Roman reinforcements could arrive. Mobile workshops accompanied the rebel army during its movements, providing essential services for equipment maintenance and repair. These facilities could be rapidly assembled and disassembled as tactical situations required, ensuring that the rebels maintained their logistical capabilities even during extended campaigns. Skilled craftsmen worked alongside the mobile workshops, repairing weapons, maintaining armour, and producing specialised equipment needed for specific operations. The winter encampment established by the rebels in the mountains of southern Italy demonstrated their growing sophistication in military engineering and camp construction. Rather than simply occupying existing defensive positions, the rebels constructed elaborate fortifications that incorporated both Roman military engineering principles and innovations adapted to their specific tactical requirements. These fortifications included multiple defensive lines, concealed supply depots, and communication systems that allowed coordination between different sections of the rebel positions. The camp's layout reflected careful planning that balanced defensive requirements with the practical needs of housing and organising thousands of fighters and their families. Living areas were arranged according to military units, facilitating command and control while maintaining the social cohesion that sustained rebel morale. Training areas allowed continued military instruction for new recruits, while workshops and storage facilities supported the logistical operations that kept the rebel army functional. The spring of 72 BCE marked the beginning of the rebels' most successful military campaign, as Spartacus led his forces in a series of engagements that would demonstrate their evolution into a formidable military organisation capable of defeating Roman armies in conventional battle. The strategic situation facing the rebels had changed dramatically since their initial escape from Capua, as Roman authorities now recognised the rebellion as a serious military threat requiring systematic suppression through professional military forces. The Senate's response to the escalating crisis involved the assignment of both consuls for 72 BCE to command operations against the rebels, reflecting the gravity of the situation and the political importance of achieving decisive victory. Lucius Gellius, Publicola, and Gnaeus Cornelius, Lentulus, Clodianus represented the pinnacle of Roman military leadership, with extensive experience in provincial campaigns and the resources necessary to mount large-scale operations against the rebel forces. Gellius commanded approximately 15,000 legionary troops, supplemented by auxiliary units and allied contingents, creating a force significantly larger than any previous Roman army deployed against the rebels. His troops were equipped with the finest available weapons and armour, supported by extensive supply trains and siege equipment that could be employed against rebel fortifications. The consul's strategic plan involved systematic elimination of rebel strongholds while preventing their escape to other regions of Italy. Lentulus Clodianus led a similar force that was intended to coordinate with Gellius in a pincer movement designed to trap the rebel army between two professional Roman armies. This strategy reflected standard Roman tactical doctrine for dealing with mobile opponents, using superior numbers and coordination to limit enemy movement while forcing decisive engagements under favourable conditions. However, the Roman commanders seriously underestimated both the size and military capabilities of the forces they would face. Intelligence reports had failed to accurately assess the rebels' numerical strength, tactical sophistication, and equipment quality. The consuls expected to encounter disorganized bands of escaped slaves armed with improvised weapons, rather than the disciplined military organization that Spartacus had created during months of successful operations. The first major engagement occurred when Gellius attempted to assault a rebel stronghold in the Apennine Mountains, expecting to overwhelm the defenders through superior numbers and equipment. The consul's forces advanced in standard Roman formation, with heavy infantry in the centre supported by cavalry on the flanks and auxiliary troops providing screening and support functions. This conventional approach played directly into Spartacus's tactical strengths, as the rebel commander had anticipated exactly this type of Roman response. The rebel defensive positions had been carefully prepared to channel Roman attacks into predetermined killing zones, where the advantages of superior numbers and equipment would be negated by terrain constraints and concentrated defensive fire. Concealed archer positions provided covering fire that disrupted Roman formations, while carefully positioned obstacles forced attacking troops into narrow corridors where they could be engaged by concentrated rebel forces. Spartacus personally commanded the rebel centre, demonstrating the leadership by example that had earned him the loyalty of fighters from multiple ethnic backgrounds. The Thracian warriors' combat skills and tactical intelligence proved crucial during the intense fighting that characterized the engagement, as he coordinated defensive responses while maintaining overall battlefield awareness. His ability to adapt tactics in real time based on changing battlefield conditions demonstrated the military expertise that set him apart from typical rebel leaders. The battle's turning point came when rebel cavalry units, composed primarily of Thracian and Gallic warriors with extensive mounted combat experience, launched coordinated attacks against the flanks of the Roman formation. These assaults exploited weaknesses in Roman deployment while demonstrating the rebels' ability to conduct complex tactical maneuvers, requiring precise timing and coordination between different units. The Roman defeat was complete and devastating, with Gellius forced to retreat after suffering heavy casualties and losing significant quantities of equipment to rebel forces. The consul's army, which had approached the engagement with confidence in Roman military superiority, found itself outmatched by opponents who combined professional military skills with intimate knowledge of the terrain and tactical innovation that Roman commanders had not anticipated. News of Gellius's defeat reached Lentulus Clodianus as he was advancing towards his planned rendezvous with his fellow consul, creating a tactical crisis that required immediate reassessment of Roman strategy. Rather than coordinating a pincer movement against trapped rebels, Lentulus now faced the prospect of engaging a victorious enemy force that had just demonstrated its ability to defeat Roman armies in conventional battle. The engagement between Lentulus's forces and the rebel army occurred several weeks later under circumstances that further demonstrated the rebels' growing military sophistication. Spartacus had used the interval between battles to reorganize his forces, integrate captured Roman equipment, and position his army to exploit tactical advantages offered by the local terrain. The rebel commander's strategic planning reflected deep understanding of both Roman military capabilities and the geographic factors that could influence battle outcomes. The rebel army that faced Lentulus bore little resemblance to the desperate fugitives who had escaped from Capua nearly a year earlier. Professional Roman weapons and armour equipped the majority of rebel fighters, while months of successful combat operations had provided tactical experience and confidence that matched their improved equipment. The rebels had evolved into a military organisation capable of challenging Roman forces using conventional tactics while retaining the flexibility to employ unconventional approaches when circumstances demanded. Lentulus's defeat proved even more decisive than his colleague's earlier failure, as the consul's forces were not merely repulsed, but systematically destroyed through tactical manoeuvres that demonstrated the rebels' mastery of combined arms warfare. Rebel infantry, cavalry, and missile troops coordinated their actions with precision that rivaled professional Roman military performance, while innovative tactical approaches exploited weaknesses in Roman formations that had not been previously identified or addressed. The psychological impact of these consecutive defeats extended far beyond their immediate military consequences, fundamentally altering perceptions of the rebellion throughout the Roman world. The victories demonstrated that escaped slaves could not only survive Roman military pressure, but could actually defeat the Republic's finest armies in direct combat. This revelation shattered assumptions about Roman invincibility while inspiring enslaved populations throughout Italy to consider joining what now appeared to be a viable path to freedom. The aftermath of the consular defeat saw explosive growth in rebel numbers as slaves abandoned estates throughout southern and central Italy to join Spartacus's forces. Agricultural workers, urban slaves, and even some free peasants flocked to the rebel standards, swelling the army to an estimated 70,000 to 120,000 followers by the summer of 72 BCE. This massive expansion created new organisational challenges while providing the human resources necessary for sustained military operations against the full might of the Roman Republic. The internal dynamics within the rebel leadership began to reflect the tensions inherent in managing such a diverse and rapidly growing organisation. While Spartacus maintained overall command through his demonstrated military success and political acumen, other commanders developed their own power bases and strategic visions that did not always align with the Thracian leader's long-term objectives. Crixus emerged as the most prominent advocate for aggressive military action designed to inflict maximum damage on Roman power structures throughout Italy. The Gallic commander's approach emphasized the symbolic and psychological aspects of the rebellion, arguing that continued victories against Roman forces would inspire broader uprising among oppressed populations, while demonstrating the vulnerability of imperial authority. His strategic vision involved systematic destruction of Roman military installations, supply networks, and administrative centres that sustained imperial control over the peninsula. The internal tensions that had been simmering within the rebel leadership throughout the winter of 71 BCE finally erupted into open disagreement as Spartacus announced his intention to lead the rebel army northward toward the Alps. The Thracian commander's strategic vision represented a fundamental shift from the aggressive raiding campaigns that had brought the rebellion its greatest military successes, advocating instead for a calculated withdrawal from Roman territory that would secure permanent freedom for his followers beyond the reach of imperial authority. Spartacus's reasoning for the Northern March reflected his deep understanding of both military realities and political dynamics that would ultimately determine the rebellion's fate. The Thracian leader recognized that despite their remarkable victories against consular armies, the rebels faced insurmountable long-term challenges in attempting to maintain their position within Italy. Roman military resources were virtually unlimited, and the Republic could continue deploying fresh armies against the rebels indefinitely, while each defeat would gradually erode the rebel forces through casualties and desertion. The strategic analysis that informed Spartacus's decision drew upon his extensive experience as a tribal warrior who had witnessed the systematic destruction of Thracian resistance to Roman expansion. He understood that Rome's ultimate strength lay not in the tactical superiority of individual armies, which the rebels had repeatedly demonstrated they could overcome, but in the Republic's ability to absorb defeats while continuously mobilizing new forces until enemy resistance was completely crushed. The pattern of Roman conquest throughout the Mediterranean had consistently followed this approach, grinding down opponents through sustained pressure rather than achieving decisive victories in single campaigns. The Alpine escape route offered several crucial advantages that made it the most viable path to permanent freedom for the rebel forces. The mountain passes provided natural defensive positions that could be held by relatively small forces against much larger pursuing armies, allowing the rebels to control the pace of any Roman pursuit while minimizing their exposure to superior enemy numbers. The rugged terrain would negate many of Rome's tactical advantages, particularly their superior cavalry and siege equipment, while favouring the irregular warfare techniques that had served the rebels so effectively. Beyond the immediate military considerations, the Alpine route would lead the rebels into regions where Roman authority was less firmly established, and local populations might prove sympathetic to their cause. The Celtic tribes of Gaul had their own grievances against Roman rule, having suffered through decades of conquest and exploitation that paralleled the experiences of the enslaved populations that formed the rebellion's core. These potential allies could provide supplies, recruits, and local knowledge that would enhance the rebels' chances of establishing permanent settlements beyond Roman reach. Spartacus also recognized that the northern route offered the best prospects for maintaining the unity of his diverse coalition. The rebels included significant numbers of Gallic and Germanic fighters, whose homelands lay beyond the Alps, and these men possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain and political conditions that would be crucial for successful passage through the mountains. Their enthusiasm for returning to familiar territory would help sustain morale during the challenging march, while their connections with tribal networks could facilitate negotiations with local populations. The Thracian commander's strategic vision extended beyond mere escape to encompass the establishment of a new society based on principles of freedom and equality that had emerged during the rebellion's development. The rebels had created functional communities that demonstrated the possibility of alternative social organizations, and Spartacus believed these experiments could be expanded into permanent settlements that would serve as refuges for escaped slaves and other refugees from Roman oppression. The fertile valleys of Gaul offered agricultural opportunities that could support large populations, while the region's distance from Roman power centres would provide security during the crucial early phases of settlement. However, Spartacus's northern strategy faced fierce opposition from significant portions of the rebel leadership, particularly Crassus and his predominantly Gallic followers, who advocated for continued military operations within Italy. The disagreement reflected fundamental differences in strategic philosophy and ultimate objectives that had been masked by the rebellion's military successes, but now threatened to tear apart the coalition that had sustained the movement through its period of greatest achievement. Crassus's opposition to the Northern March stemmed from his belief that the rebellion represented a unique opportunity to strike a decisive blow against Roman power that might inspire broader uprisings throughout the empire. The Gallic commander argued that their military victories had demonstrated Roman vulnerability, and that continued aggressive action could potentially trigger the collapse of imperial authority in southern Italy. His strategic vision emphasized the symbolic importance of maintaining pressure on Roman forces while encouraging enslaved populations throughout the peninsula to join the rebellion. The Gallic leader's approach reflected the warrior culture from which he had emerged, where honour and reputation were earned through aggressive action against enemies rather than strategic withdrawal. Crassus viewed the proposed retreat to the Alps as an abandonment of their comrades still suffering under Roman oppression, arguing that the rebels had a moral obligation to continue fighting for the liberation of all enslaved peoples rather than securing freedom for themselves alone. His passionate advocacy for continued resistance resonated strongly with many fighters who had joined the rebellion specifically to strike back against their former masters. The tactical arguments advanced by Crassus's faction focused on the immediate military advantages that the rebels currently enjoyed over Roman forces in the region. Their recent victories had provided them with extensive supplies of professional military equipment, while Roman morale remained shattered by the unprecedented defeats suffered at rebel hands. The Gallic commander argued that this temporary superiority should be exploited through aggressive campaigns that could capture major Roman cities and establish permanent rebel territories within Italy itself. Crassus also emphasized the recruitment potential that continued operations in southern Italy would provide, as thousands of additional slaves remained on estates throughout the region who might join the rebellion if presented with clear evidence of rebel military success. The Gallic leader believed that the movement's growth had reached a critical threshold, where continued expansion could transform the rebellion from a localized uprising into a general revolution that would fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout the Roman world. The strategic debate between Spartacus and Crassus reflected deeper tensions within the rebel coalition regarding leadership authority and decision-making processes. While Spartacus had maintained overall command through his demonstrated military success and political acumen, the rebellion's growth had created multiple power centres with their own constituencies and strategic perspectives. The Gallic contingent represented the largest single ethnic group within the rebel forces, and Crassus's influence had grown correspondingly as his followers achieved success in various military operations. The disagreement reached its breaking point during a series of heated councils held in the rebel winter encampments, where the fundamental differences between the two strategic approaches became irreconcilable. Spartacus presented detailed plans for the northern march, including logistics arrangements, route selection, and negotiations with potential tribal allies, demonstrating the careful preparation that had characterized his leadership throughout the rebellion. However, his methodical approach contrasted sharply with Crassus's emotional appeals for continued resistance and his emphasis on the moral obligations that the rebels owed to their enslaved brethren throughout Italy. The split that emerged from these debates represented more than a simple disagreement over tactical approaches. It reflected fundamental differences in cultural values, strategic objectives, and concepts of leadership that had been present within the rebel coalition from its inception. The Thracian emphasis on careful planning and long-term survival conflicted with the Gallic preference for aggressive action and immediate confrontation with enemies. While both approaches commanded significant support among different segments of the rebel population. The final rupture occurred in early 72 BCE, when Crassus announced his intention to lead a separate force southward to continue raiding operations in Lucania and Apulia, regardless of Spartacus's strategic directives. Approximately 30,000 rebels, primarily Gauls and Germans who shared Crassus's aggressive philosophy, chose to follow their ethnic leader rather than accept the Thracians' authority. This massive defection represented roughly 1/3 of the total rebel strength and included some of the movement's most experienced fighters and successful commanders. The departure of Crassus's force created immediate tactical and strategic challenges for both segments of the now divided rebellion. Spartacus lost not only significant numbers of fighters, but also crucial military expertise and leadership capabilities that had contributed to the rebels' previous successes. The Gallic contingent had provided essential skills in siege warfare, cavalry operations, and equipment production that would be difficult to replace, while their departure reduced the ethnic diversity that had been one of the rebellion's greatest strengths. Crixus faced even greater challenges in establishing the independence and viability of his separate force. While 30,000 fighters represented a formidable army by any standard, this number was insufficient to sustain the type of aggressive campaigns that the Gallic leader envisioned without access to the logistical networks and organizational structures that Spartacus had developed. The breakaway force also lacked the strategic depth and tactical flexibility that had characterized the unified rebel army, making it more vulnerable to concentrated Roman counterattacks. The psychological impact of the split extended throughout both rebel forces, creating uncertainty and doubt about the leadership decisions that had sustained the movement through its period of greatest success. Many fighters who remained with Spartacus questioned whether the northern march represented wisdom or cowardice, while those who followed Crixus wondered if their aggressive strategy could succeed without the resources and coordination that unity had provided. The division also provided Roman commanders with evidence of internal rebel conflicts that could potentially be exploited through political and military pressure. Roman intelligence networks quickly detected the rebel split and began developing strategies to exploit the division for maximum advantage. The separation of rebel forces created opportunities for defeating each segment individually rather than confronting the unified army that had proven so formidable in previous engagements. Roman commanders recognized that Crixus's smaller force would be particularly vulnerable to concentrated attack, while Spartacus's northern movement would expose his army to pursuit and harassment during the challenging Alpine crossing. The Senate's response to intelligence reports about the rebel division reflected both relief at the apparent weakening of the uprising and determination to prevent either faction from re-establishing the unified resistance that had proven so threatening to Roman authority. Military resources were reallocated to enable simultaneous operations against both rebel forces, with specific commanders assigned to exploit the tactical opportunities created by the split. Gellius received orders to pursue and destroy Crixus's force before it could establish secure bases in southern Italy, or recruit additional followers from the region's enslaved populations. The consul's previous defeat at rebel hands had damaged his political reputation, and successful suppression of Crixus's breakaway army offered an opportunity to restore his military credentials while eliminating a significant portion of the rebel threat. The tactical situation favoured Roman forces, as Crixus's smaller army would be easier to locate and engage than the unified rebel force had been. The campaign against Crixus began in earnest during the spring of 72 BCE, as Roman forces systematically searched the mountainous regions of southern Italy, where the Gallic leader had established his operations. Gellius employed traditional Roman tactics of area denial and resource control, occupying strategic positions that limited rebel movement while cutting off access to supplies and potential recruits. The consul's forces included significant cavalry contingents that provided mobility advantages in the open terrain of Lucania and Apulia, regions less suited to the guerrilla warfare techniques that had served the rebels so effectively in more mountainous areas. Crixus initially attempted to maintain the aggressive raiding strategy that had motivated his break with Spartacus, launching attacks against Roman settlements and supply lines, while avoiding direct confrontation with superior enemy forces. However, the reduced size of his army limited the scope and effectiveness of these operations, while Roman countermeasures gradually restricted the rebel forces' freedom of movement. The Gallic leader found himself increasingly constrained by tactical realities that his strategic vision had not adequately addressed. The decisive engagement occurred at Mount Garganus in Apulia, where Gellius succeeded in trapping Crixus's force in terrain that negated many of the tactical advantages that had served the rebels so effectively in previous battles. The mountain's steep slopes and limited escape routes prevented the rebels from employing their preferred hit-and-run tactics, while Roman numerical superiority could be brought to bear effectively in the confined battlefield. The battle itself demonstrated both the continued fighting capabilities of the rebel forces and the ultimate limitations they faced when confronting professional Roman armies under favourable conditions. Crixus personally led his warriors in desperate charges against Roman formations, displaying the individual courage and combat skills that had made him one of the rebellion's most effective commanders. However, superior Roman equipment, numerical advantages and tactical coordination gradually overwhelmed rebel resistance, despite their fierce determination. The death of Crixus during the final phases of the battle represented a devastating blow to rebel morale and military capabilities. The Gallic leader had become a symbol of successful resistance to Roman authority, and his fall demonstrated the ultimate futility of confronting imperial power through conventional military means. The loss of his charismatic leadership also eliminated one of the few commanders capable of maintaining cohesion among the diverse ethnic groups that comprised the rebel forces. The Roman victory at Mount Garganus resulted in the virtual destruction of Crixus's breakaway army, with thousands of rebels killed in battle and most survivors captured for execution or sale into slavery. Gellius ordered the crucifixion of captured rebels along the roads leading from the battlefield, creating a grim display designed to terrorize other enslaved populations while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to Roman authority. The consul's brutal suppression restored his political reputation, while eliminating roughly 1/3 of the total rebel threat. News of Crixus's defeat and death reached Spartacus as he was leading his own force northward through the Apennine Mountains, creating a crisis of morale and strategic planning that threatened to undermine the entire northern campaign. The loss of such a significant portion of the rebel army, combined with the death of one of the movement's most successful commanders, provided stark evidence of the risks inherent in confronting Roman power directly. Many of Spartacus's followers began questioning whether their own northern march represented strategic wisdom or merely a different form of defeat. The Thracian commander's response to the crisis demonstrated the political and military skills that had sustained his leadership throughout the rebellion's development. Rather than allowing grief and doubt to paralyze his forces, Spartacus used news of Crixus's death to reinforce his arguments for the northern strategy, while honouring the fallen leader's memory through continued resistance to Roman authority. He organised memorial ceremonies that celebrated Crixus's courage, while emphasising the importance of achieving the freedom that the Gallic leader had died seeking. Spartacus also used the tactical lessons from Crixus's defeat to refine his own strategic planning, recognising that the reduced size of his force required even greater emphasis on avoiding direct confrontation with superior Roman armies. The northern march would need to prioritise speed and stealth over aggressive action, using the rebels' knowledge of mountain terrain to stay ahead of pursuing forces while minimising exposure to the type of decisive battle that had destroyed Crixus's army. The continued advance toward the Alps proceeded despite the setback, as Spartacus maintained his conviction that escape from Roman territory remained the only viable path to permanent freedom for his followers. The rebel army, now reduced to approximately 40,000 fighters, but still representing a formidable force, moved through the mountainous regions of central Italy, with the disciplined organisation that had characterised their previous operations. The march demonstrated the rebels' continued military effectiveness, while highlighting the strategic vision that distinguished Spartacus from other commanders who had attempted to challenge Roman authority. The northern campaign's early phases brought the rebels into contact with Roman forces commanded by Gaius Cassius Longinus, the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, who had been ordered to prevent rebel penetration into the Alpine regions. Cassius commanded substantial military resources including regular legionary troops, auxiliary units recruited from local populations, and cavalry forces that provided mobility advantages in the more open terrain of northern Italy. The governor's strategic position allowed him to control the major Alpine passes, while maintaining communication with other Roman commanders, coordinating the overall campaign against the rebellion. The engagement between Spartacus's forces and Cassius's army demonstrated the continued tactical superiority that the rebels maintained over Roman forces when fighting under favourable conditions. The Thracian commander's intimate knowledge of mountain warfare, combined with his army's experience and equipment advantages gained through previous victories, enabled the rebels to outmaneuver and defeat the Roman forces despite facing a well-prepared enemy in his own territory. The victory over Cassius had opened the Alpine passes to Spartacus and his rebel army, creating what appeared to be a clear path to freedom beyond the reach of Roman authority. The defeated governor's forces had withdrawn in disorder, leaving the mountain routes undefended and accessible to the advancing rebel columns. Intelligence gathered from captured Roman soldiers confirmed that no significant military obstacles remained between the rebels and the Gallic territories where they could establish permanent settlements beyond imperial control. Yet in one of history's most puzzling strategic decisions, Spartacus chose to halt the northward advance, and instead ordered his army to turn south, back toward the very heart of Roman power from which they had been retreating. This dramatic reversal of strategy has generated intense scholarly debate for over 2 millennia, as historians have struggled to understand why a commander of Spartacus's demonstrated tactical brilliance would abandon a successful escape route in favour of returning to face the concentrated might of the Roman Republic. The most compelling explanation for this fateful decision lies in the complex internal dynamics that had developed within the rebel army during its months of successful operations. While Spartacus had maintained overall command through his military victories and strategic acumen, the diverse composition of his forces created competing pressures and expectations that could not be easily reconciled through conventional military leadership. The army included not only escaped gladiators and agricultural slaves, but also significant numbers of free peasants, displaced persons, and even some Roman citizens who had joined the rebellion for various personal and political reasons. Many of these followers had never intended to abandon Italy permanently, viewing the rebellion instead as an opportunity to improve their circumstances within the existing social framework rather than escape it entirely. The agricultural slaves, who comprised a large portion of the rebel forces, possessed deep connections to the Italian countryside, where they had lived and worked for years or decades. Their families, cultural ties, and intimate knowledge of local conditions created powerful incentives to remain in familiar territory, rather than venture into the unknown regions beyond the Alps. The psychological impact of prolonged military success had also fundamentally altered the rebels' perception of their capabilities and prospects. The string of victories against Roman armies, including the defeats of praetors and consuls, had created a sense of invincibility that made continued resistance seem not only possible but inevitable. Many rebels had come to believe that their military superiority over Roman forces was permanent rather than circumstantial, leading them to underestimate the long-term challenges they would face in sustaining their resistance. The influence of Crixus's faction, despite the Gallic leader's death, continued to shape strategic discussions within the rebel leadership. The aggressive philosophy that had motivated the breakaway force remained popular among significant segments of the army, particularly those who viewed the rebellion as a moral crusade against Roman oppression rather than simply a means of securing personal freedom. These fighters argued that abandoning Italy would constitute a betrayal of the enslaved populations who remained under Roman control and could potentially be liberated through continued military action. The pressure from these internal constituencies may have been reinforced by intelligence reports, suggesting that Roman military preparations were less advanced than Spartacus had anticipated. The defeats suffered by various Roman commanders had created political chaos within the Senate, delaying the appointment of unified leadership and the mobilization of resources necessary for a coordinated campaign against the rebels. This apparent Roman weakness could have encouraged the belief that continued operations in Italy offered better prospects for success than the uncertain challenges of establishing new settlements in foreign territory. Another significant factor in Spartacus's decision may have been the discovery of potential betrayal by Alpine tribal leaders who had initially appeared willing to facilitate the rebels' passage through their territories. Celtic tribes in the region had their own complex relationships with Rome, involving treaties, tribute arrangements, and hostage exchanges that created incentives for cooperation with imperial authorities rather than support for escaped slaves. Intelligence gathered during the northern advance may have revealed that tribal leaders were planning to trap the rebel army in mountain passes where they could be destroyed by coordinated attacks involving both tribal forces and pursuing Roman armies. The logistical challenges of supporting a massive army during an Alpine crossing also presented formidable obstacles that may have appeared insurmountable as the rebels approached the mountain passes. The rebel force, numbering tens of thousands of fighters plus their families and followers, required enormous quantities of food, equipment, and other supplies that would be difficult to obtain in the sparsely populated mountain regions. The onset of winter would have made these challenges even more severe, as the rebels lacked the specialized equipment and experience necessary for sustained operations in harsh mountain conditions. The strategic intelligence available to Spartacus may have indicated that Roman forces were already moving to cut off potential escape routes through the Alps, making the northern strategy increasingly risky as pursuing armies closed the distance behind the rebel force. The Romans possessed superior knowledge of the mountain terrain through their extensive military operations in Gaul, along with established relationships with tribal leaders that could be leveraged to coordinate attacks against the rebels. Under these circumstances, continuing northward might have led the rebel army into a carefully prepared trap rather than the freedom they sought. Whatever combination of factors motivated Spartacus's decision, the southward turn marked a fundamental shift in the rebellion's trajectory that would ultimately determine its fate. The rebel army that had seemed poised to escape Roman territory and establish permanent freedom beyond imperial reach, instead found itself marching back toward the regions where Roman authority was strongest and military resources most concentrated. This decision would test the rebels' military capabilities against the full might of the Roman Republic, while eliminating the strategic flexibility that had sustained their previous successes. The march back through central Italy demonstrated that the rebels retained their formidable military effectiveness, despite the strategic reversal. Roman forces that attempted to intercept or harass the rebel columns found themselves outmatched by opponents who had perfected their tactical coordination through months of successful operations. The rebel army moved with disciplined organization that reflected their evolution from desperate fugitives into a professional military force capable of complex maneuvers and sustained campaigns. The psychological impact of the rebels' return created panic throughout the regions they traversed, as Roman citizens and officials who had believed the threat was moving away from their territories suddenly found themselves facing the prospect of renewed rebel operations in their vicinity. The sight of tens of thousands of armed former slaves marching in organized formations provided stark evidence that the rebellion remained a formidable threat despite the setbacks it had suffered through internal divisions and Roman military pressure. Local Roman commanders found themselves unable to mount effective resistance against the rebel advance, as their forces were insufficient to engage such a large and experienced enemy army in direct combat. The rebels' reputation for tactical innovation and their demonstrated ability to defeat superior Roman forces created a climate of fear that paralyzed potential opposition while encouraging additional recruits to join their ranks. Agricultural slaves throughout the regions traversed by the rebel army abandoned their masters' estates in increasing numbers, swelling the rebel forces despite the losses suffered during previous campaigns. The Roman Senate's response to news of the rebels' return reflected both alarm at the strategic implications and frustration with the military failures that had allowed the situation to deteriorate so severely. The rebellion that had initially been dismissed as a minor security problem had evolved into an existential threat to Roman authority in southern Italy, requiring mobilization of resources on a scale typically reserved for major foreign wars. The political consequences of continued military failures threatened the careers and reputations of senators and commanders associated with the failed suppression efforts. The appointment of Marcus Licinius Crassus to command the campaign against Spartacus represented the Senate's recognition that conventional military approaches had proven inadequate against the rebel forces. Crassus possessed both the personal wealth necessary to finance large-scale military operations and the political connections required to mobilize the Republic's full resources against the rebellion. His reputation for ruthless efficiency and willingness to employ extreme measures made him an ideal choice for suppressing what had become the most serious internal threat Rome had faced in generations. The rebel armies' continued advance southward brought them into the regions of Lucania and Bruttium, where the mountainous terrain and sparse Roman military presence offered opportunities for establishing secure bases while planning their next strategic moves. However, the decision to return to southern Italy also limited the rebels' strategic options, as they now found themselves in a geographical cul-de-sac with limited escape routes and increasing Roman military pressure from multiple directions. It was during this period that Spartacus began exploring alternative strategies that might achieve the rebellion's objectives without requiring the direct confrontation with concentrated Roman forces that had proven so costly for Crixus's breakaway army. The Thracian commander's attention turned toward the possibility of evacuating his forces by sea, using ships to transport the rebel army to territories beyond Roman control where they could establish permanent settlements without facing the logistical challenges of an overland march through hostile territory. The strategic appeal of maritime evacuation was enhanced by historical precedents from the previous century's slave revolts in Sicily, where rebel leaders had successfully used sea transport to extend their operations and establish secure bases on islands beyond immediate Roman reach. The Sicilian revolts had demonstrated that slave armies could maintain their effectiveness when supported by naval capabilities, while the isolation provided by water barriers offered protection against the type of sustained Roman pressure that eventually wore down land-based rebellions. Intelligence gathered by rebel scouts indicated that Cilician pirates operating in the waters off southern Italy possessed both the ships and the maritime expertise necessary to transport large numbers of people across the Mediterranean. These pirates had established themselves as a significant force in regional politics, maintaining bases throughout the eastern Mediterranean while conducting operations that challenged Roman naval supremacy. Their reputation for commercial pragmatism suggested they might be willing to negotiate transportation arrangements in exchange for appropriate compensation. The Cilician pirates represented one of the most formidable naval powers of the late Republican period, operating fleets that numbered in the hundreds of vessels and controlled extensive territories throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Their organization combined commercial enterprise with military effectiveness, creating a maritime empire that challenged Roman authority while providing services to various clients throughout the region. The pirates' success had been built upon their ability to adapt quickly to changing political and military circumstances, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for sustained operations against superior conventional forces. The pirates' relationship with Rome was complex and constantly evolving, involving periods of cooperation, conflict, and uneasy coexistence that reflected the practical realities of Mediterranean politics. While Roman authorities officially condemned piracy and periodically launched military campaigns against pirate strongholds, the Republic also benefited from pirate activities that disrupted enemy commerce and provided access to goods and services that were difficult to obtain through conventional channels. This ambiguous relationship created opportunities for negotiation that might not have existed with more conventional political entities. Spartacus's decision to pursue negotiations with the Cilician pirates reflected his recognition that the rebellion required new strategic approaches if it was to avoid the fate that had befallen Crixus's forces. The maritime evacuation strategy offered several crucial advantages over continued land-based operations, including the ability to bypass Roman military concentrations while accessing territories where the rebels could establish permanent settlements without facing immediate imperial pressure. The use of professional naval forces would also provide the rebels with capabilities they could not develop independently, given their lack of maritime experience and shipbuilding resources. The initial contacts between rebel representatives and Cilician pirate leaders were conducted through intermediaries who possessed the necessary connections and credibility to facilitate negotiations between such disparate organizations. These preliminary discussions focused on establishing the basic parameters for potential cooperation, including the number of people to be transported, the destinations that might be available, and the compensation that would be required for such an extensive operation. The pirates' initial response to rebel overtures appeared encouraging, as their leaders expressed interest in the commercial opportunities that such a large-scale transportation contract would provide. The Cilicians possessed extensive knowledge of potential destinations throughout the Mediterranean, including islands and coastal regions where large populations could be settled without immediate interference from Roman or other imperial authorities. Their maritime expertise would be essential for planning and executing the complex logistics required to transport tens of thousands of people across potentially hostile waters. The negotiation process revealed the sophisticated organizational capabilities that both the rebels and the pirates had developed through their respective challenges to Roman authority. Both groups had evolved beyond simple banditry or resistance to become complex political and military organizations capable of sustained operations and strategic planning. The discussions involved detailed consideration of routes, timing, security arrangements, and contingency plans that reflected the professional competence of both parties. However, the fundamental differences in organizational culture and strategic objectives between the land-based rebellion and the maritime pirate confederation created tensions that would ultimately undermine the potential partnership. The rebels' primary motivation was securing permanent freedom from Roman oppression, while the pirates' interests centered on commercial profit and maintaining their existing operations. These divergent priorities created conflicts over compensation, risk assessment, and operational security that proved difficult to resolve through conventional diplomatic channels. The compensation demands presented by the Cilician pirates reflected both the scale of the proposed operation and their assessment of the risks involved in transporting such a large and politically sensitive cargo. The pirates required payment in gold and silver that would compensate them not only for the immediate costs of the transportation operation, but also for the potential loss of future commercial opportunities if their cooperation with the rebels resulted in increased Roman pressure on their existing operations. The rebels' ability to meet these financial demands was limited by their reliance on plunder and tribute rather than conventional economic activity. While their military successes had provided access to significant quantities of wealth through the capture of Roman supply convoys and the sacking of various settlements, converting this wealth into the specific forms of payment required by the pirates presented logistical challenges that were complicated by the ongoing military pressure from pursuing Roman forces. The negotiation process was further complicated by the need for absolute secrecy, as any intelligence about the proposed evacuation that reached Roman authorities would enable them to develop countermeasures that could destroy both the rebel army and the pirate fleet. The rebels lacked secure communication networks that could facilitate extended negotiations while maintaining operational security, forcing them to rely on intermediaries whose loyalty and discretion could not be guaranteed under the extreme pressures of the developing military situation. As the negotiations continued, Spartacus maintained his army's movement southward toward the coastal regions, where the proposed embarkation would take place. The rebel force established temporary camps in the mountainous terrain of Bruttium, using the natural defensive advantages of the region to maintain security, while the complex diplomatic and logistical arrangements were finalized. The rebels' presence in the area created additional pressure on the negotiation process, as Roman forces under Crassus's command were steadily closing the distance and threatening to eliminate the maritime evacuation option through direct military action. The final stages of the negotiation appeared to reach successful conclusion when Cilician representatives agreed to provide the necessary ships and crews in exchange for the substantial payments that had been negotiated. The pirates confirmed their ability to transport the entire rebel force, including families and followers, to Sicily, where previous slave revolts had demonstrated the possibility of establishing independent territories beyond immediate Roman control. The island's strategic location and defensive advantages made it an ideal destination for a population seeking to establish permanent freedom from imperial authority. The betrayal came without warning or apparent provocation, as the Cilician pirates who had accepted payment and confirmed their commitment to the transportation operation simply failed to appear at the designated rendezvous points. The rebel army, which had positioned itself along the coast in preparation for embarkation, found itself stranded without the maritime support that had become central to their strategic planning. The ships that should have provided salvation instead remained invisible beyond the horizon, leaving tens of thousands of rebels trapped in the tow of Italy, with Roman armies closing in from multiple directions. The pirates' decision to abandon their agreement with the rebels reflected calculations that prioritized their long-term commercial interests over short-term profit from the transportation contract. Intelligence about Crassus's military preparations may have convinced the Cilician leaders that association with the rebels would result in devastating Roman retaliation against their existing operations throughout the Mediterranean. The pirates' survival depended on maintaining sufficient flexibility to adapt to changing political circumstances, and supporting a rebellion that appeared increasingly likely to fail would have compromised their ability to negotiate future arrangements with Roman authorities. The betrayal by the Cilician pirates left Spartacus facing the gravest crisis of his military career, but the Roman Senate's response to the escalating rebellion would prove even more decisive than the collapse of the maritime evacuation plan. The appointment of Marcus Licinius Crassus as praetor with extraordinary powers represented a fundamental shift in Rome's approach to suppressing the slave revolt, moving beyond the conventional military responses that had failed so spectacularly against the rebel forces to embrace systematic warfare designed to crush resistance through overwhelming force and unprecedented brutality. Crassus brought to his command a unique combination of personal wealth, political connections, and military experience that distinguished him from the previous commanders who had suffered defeat at rebel hands. His fortune, accumulated through real estate speculation, silver mining operations, and slave trading, provided him with the financial resources necessary to sustain large-scale military operations without relying entirely on Senate appropriations. This economic independence allowed Crassus to implement strategies that might have been politically or financially impossible for commanders dependent on public funding, including the maintenance of larger armies for extended periods and the employment of specialized equipment and tactics. The praetor's military background included extensive service in provincial campaigns and frontier warfare that had provided him with intimate knowledge of unconventional tactics and the challenges posed by irregular opponents. Unlike his predecessors, who had approached the rebellion as a conventional military problem requiring standard Roman solutions, Crassus recognized that the rebels' success stemmed from their ability to exploit weaknesses in traditional legionary formations and tactics. His strategic planning reflected this understanding, incorporating innovations designed specifically to counter the advantages that had sustained rebel resistance for nearly 2 years. The military resources allocated to Crassus's command represented the largest force yet assembled against the rebellion, comprising 8 full legions totaling approximately 40,000 experienced troops supplemented by extensive auxiliary units, cavalry formations, and specialized engineering corps. This massive army reflected the Senate's recognition that previous half measures had not only failed to suppress the revolt, but had actually strengthened rebel capabilities through the capture of Roman equipment and the demonstration of imperial vulnerability. The new force was equipped with the finest available weapons and armor, supported by sophisticated supply networks, and organized according to tactical innovations that Crassus had developed through careful analysis of previous Roman defeats. The legions assigned to Crassus's command included veteran units drawn from successful campaigns in Spain, Gaul, and the eastern provinces, ensuring that his forces possessed the experience and discipline necessary for sustained operations against formidable opponents. These troops had proven themselves in conventional warfare against professional enemies and possessed the tactical flexibility required for adaptation to the unconventional challenges posed by the rebel forces. Their equipment included the latest innovations in Roman military technology, including improved armour designs, enhanced siege equipment, and specialised weapons developed for specific tactical applications. However, Crassus understood that superior numbers and equipment alone would not guarantee success against opponents who had repeatedly demonstrated their ability to overcome such advantages through tactical innovation and superior motivation. The praetor's first priority involved restoring the discipline and fighting spirit that had been shattered by previous defeats, recognizing that Roman military effectiveness depended as much on psychological factors as on material superiority. The demoralization that had spread through Roman forces following their defeats at rebel hands required dramatic action to restore confidence and eliminate the defeatist attitudes that had contributed to tactical failures. The solution that Crassus implemented demonstrated both his understanding of Roman military psychology and his willingness to employ extreme measures to achieve his objectives. The ancient practice of decimation, which had fallen into disuse during the late Republic due to its severity and potential political consequences, was revived as a means of restoring discipline while demonstrating the consequences of military failure. This brutal punishment involved the execution of every 10th soldier in units that had shown cowardice or failed to meet combat standards, creating a climate of fear that would compel improved performance while eliminating those deemed unreliable. The decimation process was conducted with methodical precision that reflected both Roman organizational efficiency and Crassus's determination to establish absolute authority over his forces. Units selected for punishment were assembled in formation, while lots were drawn to determine which soldiers would face execution. The condemned men were beaten to death by their fellow soldiers using clubs and stones, creating a traumatic shared experience that bound the survivors together while demonstrating the fatal consequences of military failure. The psychological impact of witnessing comrades die for collective failures created powerful incentives for individual excellence while establishing Crassus's reputation for ruthless leadership. The implementation of decimation extended beyond its immediate disciplinary effects to serve broader strategic purposes within Crassus's campaign planning. The dramatic punishment demonstrated to both Roman forces and potential rebel sympathizers that the new command represented a fundamental escalation in the conflict's intensity and stakes. The message was clear. This campaign would be prosecuted with unprecedented determination and brutality, eliminating any possibility of negotiated settlement or partial success. The rebels would face complete destruction or achieve total victory, with no middle ground available for compromise or accommodation. The restoration of military discipline through decimation was accompanied by comprehensive reforms in training, tactics, and organisation that addressed the specific weaknesses Roman forces had displayed in previous engagements with the rebels. Crassus implemented intensive drilling programs that emphasised the coordination and flexibility necessary for effective combat against opponents who employed unconventional tactics. Standard Roman formations were modified to provide greater mobility and responsiveness, while new techniques were developed for fighting in the mountainous terrain where the rebels had achieved their greatest successes. The tactical innovations introduced by Crassus reflected careful analysis of previous Roman defeats and the methods that had enabled rebel victories. Traditional legionary formations, with their emphasis on rigid discipline and coordinated movement, had proven vulnerable to the hit-and-run tactics and terrain advantages that the rebels exploited so effectively. The new approaches emphasized smaller unit operations, improved communication systems, and tactical flexibility that could adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions without sacrificing the coordination that remained essential to Roman military effectiveness. Training programs were intensified to prepare Roman forces for the specific challenges they would face in combat against experienced gladiators and former warriors who possessed superior individual fighting skills. Soldiers practiced techniques for close-quarters combat, irregular warfare, and operations in difficult terrain that had not been emphasized in conventional military preparation. The enhanced training regimen also included psychological conditioning designed to overcome the fear and demoralization that had contributed to previous Roman failures, building confidence through demonstrated competence and success in controlled environments. While Crassus was implementing these military reforms, his strategic planning focused on the construction of massive fortifications designed to trap the rebel forces in southern Italy and eliminate their strategic mobility. The project represented one of the most ambitious engineering undertakings in Roman military history, involving the construction of a continuous barrier across the entire width of the Bruttium Peninsula that would prevent rebel movement while creating conditions for their systematic destruction through siege warfare and attrition. The fortification system that Crassus envisioned extended from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea, spanning approximately 37 miles of mountainous terrain that included forests, rivers, and steep ridges that complicated construction while providing natural defensive advantages. The barrier consisted of a continuous earthwork rampart 15 feet high and topped with wooden palisades, fronted by a ditch 15 feet deep and equally wide that was filled with sharpened stakes designed to impede assault attempts. The scale of this construction project required the coordinated labour of thousands of soldiers working around the clock for several months, demonstrating both Roman engineering capabilities and Crassus's determination to eliminate any possibility of rebel escape. The strategic concept underlying the fortification reflected Crassus's understanding that the rebels' greatest advantage lay in their mobility and ability to choose when and where to engage Roman forces. By trapping them in the confined space of southern Bruttium, the barrier would eliminate these tactical advantages while creating conditions that favoured Roman strengths in conventional siege warfare and sustained military operations. The rebels would be forced to either assault the fortifications directly, exposing themselves to concentrated Roman defensive fire, or remain trapped in territory with limited resources that could not sustain their large army indefinitely. The construction process revealed the sophisticated logistical capabilities that Roman military engineering had developed through centuries of campaign experience. Supply lines were established to provide the enormous quantities of tools, materials and provisions required for such an extensive project, while specialized engineering units supervised construction techniques that ensured structural integrity and defensive effectiveness. The work proceeded according to carefully planned schedules that coordinated different sections of the barrier, while maintaining security against potential rebel attacks on the construction sites. The psychological impact of the fortification project extended far beyond its immediate military objectives, serving as a visible demonstration of Roman determination and engineering prowess that was designed to demoralize rebel forces while inspiring confidence among Roman troops and civilian populations. The sight of the massive barrier rising across the landscape provided tangible evidence that the rebellion would face systematic suppression through methods that the rebels could not match or counter effectively. The construction also demonstrated Crassus's strategic patience and willingness to invest time and resources in comprehensive solutions rather than seeking quick victories through conventional military action. The rebel response to the construction of Crassus's barrier revealed both their continued military capabilities and the strategic limitations they faced in their increasingly desperate situation. Spartacus organized systematic attacks on construction sites, attempting to disrupt the work while capturing tools and materials that could be used for rebel purposes. These operations demonstrated the rebels' retained tactical effectiveness and their ability to coordinate complex military actions despite the pressures they faced from encirclement and resource shortages. However, the rebel attacks on the fortification sites also exposed the fundamental weakness of their strategic position, as they were forced to engage Roman forces under conditions that favoured conventional military responses rather than the irregular tactics that had served them so effectively in previous campaigns. The construction sites were heavily defended by troops specifically positioned to repel rebel assaults, while the open terrain around many work areas negated the terrain advantages that had been crucial to rebel success. The attacks achieved limited tactical success, while consuming resources and manpower that the rebels could not afford to lose in their deteriorating situation. The completion of major sections of the barrier during the winter months of 72, 71 BCE marked a decisive shift in the strategic balance between Roman and rebel forces. The fortification had achieved its primary objective of restricting rebel movement and eliminating their ability to seek supplies and recruits from the broader Italian countryside. The rebels found themselves confined to an area that could not sustain their numbers indefinitely, while Roman forces maintained secure supply lines and reinforcement capabilities that ensured their long-term advantages in any prolonged confrontation. The siege conditions created by the completed fortifications began to produce the effects that Crassus had anticipated, as food shortages and resource constraints gradually weakened rebel capabilities while maintaining pressure on their leadership to attempt desperate breakout operations. The psychological pressure of encirclement, combined with the visible evidence of Roman engineering superiority, began to erode the confidence and unity that had sustained the rebellion through its previous challenges. Desertion rates increased as individual rebels concluded that continued resistance offered no realistic prospects for survival or success. Crassus's systematic approach to suppressing the rebellion contrasted sharply with the hasty and often poorly coordinated tactics employed by his predecessors, reflecting both his personal strategic philosophy and his understanding of the specific challenges posed by the rebel forces. Rather than seeking immediate confrontation or attempting to achieve quick victories through conventional military action, the praetor implemented a methodical campaign designed to eliminate rebel advantages while maximizing Roman strengths in sustained operations and resource management. The strategic patience demonstrated by Crassus's approach reflected his recognition that time favoured Roman forces in any prolonged confrontation with the rebels. While the slave army had achieved remarkable success through tactical innovation and superior motivation, their long-term sustainability depended on continued access to supplies, recruits, and territory that could support their operations. The fortification system eliminated these essential requirements while creating conditions where Roman advantages in numbers, equipment, and logistical support could be decisive factors in determining the conflict's outcome. The winter of 71 BCE brought unprecedented hardship to the trapped rebel forces as Crassus's wall began to achieve its intended effects. The massive fortification stretched across the narrowest point of the Bruttium Peninsula like an iron band, its 15-foot rampart topped with sharpened stakes, creating a seemingly impenetrable barrier between the rebels and the rest of Italy. Behind this wall, approximately 60,000 rebels found themselves compressed into an area roughly equivalent to modern-day Calabria's southern tip, where the mountainous terrain and limited agricultural resources could not sustain such a large population indefinitely. The psychological pressure of encirclement began manifesting in ways that threatened the internal cohesion that had sustained the rebellion through its previous challenges. Food rationing became increasingly severe as foraging parties returned with diminishing supplies from the picked-over countryside. The rebels had consumed or destroyed most readily available resources during their initial occupation of the region, and the systematic nature of their confinement prevented access to the agricultural wealth of central Italy that had previously sustained their operations. Hunting parties reported declining game populations, while the coastal waters provided insufficient fish to supplement the army's dietary requirements significantly. Medical conditions within the rebel camps deteriorated as malnutrition weakened immune systems and overcrowding facilitated the spread of disease. The rebels lacked the sophisticated medical infrastructure that Roman armies maintained through their established supply networks, forcing them to rely on traditional remedies and the limited knowledge of individuals with healing experience. Dysentery and other intestinal ailments became common as sanitation systems designed for temporary encampments proved inadequate for prolonged occupation by such large numbers. The death toll from disease began approaching casualties suffered in military engagements, creating additional demoralization among fighters who had survived Roman swords only to face slower deaths from preventable illnesses. The winter weather compounded these challenges as the rebels struggled to maintain adequate shelter and warmth, without access to the resources they had previously obtained through raiding operations. The mountainous terrain of Bruttium offered some natural protection from the elements, but the caves and overhangs that provided shelter were insufficient to house tens of thousands of people comfortably. Improvised shelters constructed from available materials provided minimal protection against the cold and rain that characterized the region's winter climate, while fuel for heating fires became increasingly scarce as accessible timber was consumed. Spartacus recognized that these deteriorating conditions would eventually destroy his army more effectively than Roman military action, making a breakout attempt not merely desirable but absolutely essential for the rebellion's survival. The Thracian commander's strategic analysis indicated that waiting for improved conditions would only worsen their situation, as spring would bring renewed Roman military pressure, while their own capabilities continued to decline through attrition and demoralization. The longer they remained trapped behind Crassus's wall, the weaker they would become and the less likely any escape attempt would succeed. The planning for the winter breakout required careful consideration of multiple factors that would determine its success or failure. The rebels needed to identify the weakest sections of the Roman fortification while simultaneously preparing their forces for the type of coordinated assault that would be necessary to breach the barrier before Roman reinforcements could seal any gaps. Intelligence gathering became crucial as rebel scouts attempted to map Roman defensive positions, guard rotations, and the structural characteristics of different sections of the wall that might be vulnerable to concentrated attack. The reconnaissance operations revealed that Crassus had anticipated potential breakout attempts and had positioned his forces accordingly. The Roman camps were strategically located to provide overlapping fields of fire that could concentrate defensive strength at any point where the rebels might attempt to breach the fortifications. Signal systems using fire beacons and horn calls allowed rapid communication between different sections of the Roman line, enabling coordinated responses to rebel activities within minutes of detection. The engineering of the wall itself incorporated defensive features designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where Roman advantages in equipment and training could be maximized. However, the rebel scouts also identified potential weaknesses in the Roman defensive system that could be exploited through careful planning and coordinated action. The sheer length of the fortification meant that Roman forces were necessarily dispersed across a wide front, creating sections where local numerical superiority might be achieved through concentrated rebel assault. Weather conditions during winter storms reduced visibility and made communication between Roman positions more difficult, creating opportunities for surprise attacks that might succeed before coordinated defensive responses could be organized. The technical challenges of breaching the fortification required innovative solutions that drew upon the diverse skills represented within the rebel army. Former siege engineers and construction workers contributed knowledge of structural weaknesses that could be exploited, while metal workers developed tools and weapons specifically designed for assault operations against fortified positions. The rebels manufactured scaling ladders, grappling hooks, and battering rams using materials salvaged from their surroundings, demonstrating the continued resourcefulness that had characterized their resistance throughout the rebellion. The selection of the assault point reflected careful analysis of both tactical and strategic considerations that would influence the breakout's success. The rebels chose a section of the wall where the terrain provided concealment for their approach, while offering multiple escape routes if the initial assault failed. The target area was located near a stream that had required the Romans to construct a more complex section of fortification, creating potential structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The proximity to forested terrain would provide cover for the rebel force during their withdrawal, while the distance from major Roman camps would delay the arrival of reinforcements. Spartacus organised the assault force using the military hierarchy that had evolved during the rebellion's development, ensuring that experienced commanders led units composed of fighters with complementary skills and equipment. The initial assault wave consisted primarily of former gladiators, whose close combat training made them ideally suited for the type of fighting that would be required to overcome Roman defensive positions. These elite units were supported by larger formations of agricultural slaves and other fighters who would exploit any breaches created by the initial attack, while providing the numerical strength necessary to overwhelm local Roman resistance. The timing of the breakout attempt was coordinated with weather conditions that would provide maximum advantage to the attacking rebels, while hampering Roman defensive responses. The assault began during a winter storm that reduced visibility and muffled sound, allowing the rebel force to approach the wall without detection by Roman sentries. The wind and rain that made conditions miserable for both sides also created opportunities for surprise that would not have existed during clear weather, when Roman observation posts could have detected rebel movements from considerable distances. The initial phase of the assault achieved complete tactical surprise as rebel fighters emerged from the storm-shrouded darkness to overwhelm Roman guard posts before alarms could be raised. The months of careful preparation proved their value as specialized assault teams used their custom-built equipment to scale the rampart, while others attacked the wooden palisades with axes and crowbars. The rebels' gladiatorial training proved invaluable during the close-quarters combat that erupted along the wall's parapet, as their individual fighting skills gave them significant advantages over regular legionary troops caught off guard by the sudden attack. The breakthrough came when rebel engineers succeeded in creating a gap in the palisade that was wide enough to allow passage for large numbers of fighters. The structural damage they inflicted could not be quickly repaired under combat conditions, creating a permanent breach that would remain open as long as the rebels could maintain control of the immediate area. The success of this phase of the operation validated the technical planning that had gone into the assault while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of rebel military capabilities despite months of siege conditions. The expansion of the breach required sustained fighting as Roman reinforcements arrived from nearby camps and attempted to seal the gap before significant numbers of rebels could escape. The battle that developed around the wall section became a desperate struggle for control of a few hundred yards of fortification that would determine the fate of the entire rebel army. Roman forces brought their superior equipment and training to bear in an effort to contain the breakout, while the rebels fought with the desperation of men who understood that failure meant death or re-enslavement for themselves and their families. The fighting along the wall demonstrated both the military skills that the rebels had developed and the fundamental challenges they faced in confronting Roman forces under conditions that favoured conventional military responses. The confined space of the breach negated many of the tactical advantages that had served the rebels so effectively in previous engagements, while Roman numerical superiority could be concentrated at the critical point more effectively than in open field battles. The rebels' individual fighting prowess remained superior, but the structural advantages of defensive positions allowed Roman forces to inflict casualties while minimizing their own losses. The decisive moment came when Spartacus personally led a charge that overwhelmed the Roman defensive line and secured control of a section of the wall sufficient to allow the systematic evacuation of the rebel army. The Thracian commander's presence at the critical point provided the inspiration and tactical coordination necessary to overcome Roman resistance, while demonstrating the leadership qualities that had sustained the rebellion through its darkest moments. His combat skills, honed through years of gladiatorial training and tribal warfare, proved crucial in the hand-to-hand fighting that determined control of the breach. The successful breakout required several hours of sustained combat as tens of thousands of rebels passed through the gap in the fortifications, while rearguard units held off Roman counterattacks. The evacuation proceeded according to predetermined plans that prioritized essential personnel and equipment, while ensuring that families and non-combatants were not abandoned during the chaotic withdrawal. The rebels demonstrated remarkable discipline during this phase of the operation, maintaining organizational coherence despite the pressures of combat and the urgency of escape. The Roman response to the breakout revealed both the effectiveness of Crassus's defensive preparations and the limitations inherent in static fortification systems when facing determined opponents with superior tactical skills. While the wall had successfully contained the rebels for months and inflicted severe hardships that weakened their capabilities, it could not prevent a well-planned and executed assault by forces willing to accept heavy casualties in exchange for freedom. The breach created by the rebels could not be sealed quickly enough to prevent their escape, despite the rapid response of Roman reinforcements. The aftermath of the winter breakout marked a crucial turning point in the rebellion's final phase, as Spartacus had succeeded in freeing his army from the trap that Crassus had constructed, while demonstrating the continued viability of rebel resistance. However, the escape came at enormous cost in casualties and resources, while the strategic situation remained fundamentally unchanged. The rebels had avoided immediate destruction, but remained trapped in southern Italy with limited options for long-term survival, while Roman forces retained their overwhelming advantages in numbers, equipment, and logistical support. The political implications of the successful breakout reverberated throughout Rome as news of Crassus's failure reached the capital and created fresh concerns about the military situation in southern Italy. The Senate had invested enormous resources in the construction of the wall and the maintenance of the forces necessary to contain the rebellion, making the rebels' escape a significant political embarrassment that threatened to undermine confidence in Roman military capabilities. The failure also raised questions about Crassus's leadership and strategic competence, creating pressure for alternative approaches to suppressing the revolt. The arrival of Pompey's legions from Spain added a new dimension to the political and military dynamics surrounding the rebellion's suppression. Pompey had completed his successful campaign against Sertorius and was returning to Italy with battle-tested troops who possessed extensive experience in unconventional warfare against irregular opponents. His reputation as one of Rome's most successful military commanders created expectations that his involvement would bring the rebellion to a swift conclusion, while potentially overshadowing Crassus's contributions to the campaign. The political rivalry between Crassus and Pompey added urgency to the military situation, as both commanders recognized that credit for suppressing the rebellion would significantly enhance the victor's political standing, while failure would damage reputations and future prospects. Crassus understood that he needed to achieve decisive victory before Pompey's arrival allowed his rival to claim credit for ending the revolt, creating pressure for aggressive action that might compromise the methodical approach that had characterized his previous operations. The rebel army that emerged from the winter breakout bore the scars of months of siege conditions, but retained the core military capabilities that had sustained their resistance throughout the rebellion's development. The successful escape had restored confidence in Spartacus's leadership, while demonstrating that Roman military superiority was not absolute. However, the rebels also understood that their strategic options remained severely limited, as they lacked the resources necessary for sustained operations while facing the combined pressure of multiple Roman armies converging on their position. The fragmentation that had begun to appear within rebel ranks during the siege intensified as different groups developed conflicting ideas about the best response to their desperate situation. Some fighters advocated for immediate attempts to break through Roman lines and escape to other regions where they might find refuge or support, while others argued for negotiated surrender that might secure better treatment than they could expect after military defeat. The unity of purpose that had sustained the rebellion through its period of greatest success began to fracture under the pressure of seemingly impossible circumstances. Spartacus faced the challenge of maintaining cohesion among his diverse followers while developing strategies that could address their deteriorating situation. The winter breakout had demonstrated that dramatic action remained possible, but the fundamental strategic problems that had trapped the rebellion in southern Italy persisted despite their tactical success. The Thracian commander needed to balance the competing demands and expectations of his followers, while preparing for what appeared to be the final confrontation with Roman forces that would determine the rebellion's ultimate fate. The strategic deadlock that had developed following the winter breakout from Crassus's wall created a situation of mounting desperation for both Roman and rebel forces as the spring of 71 BCE brought renewed military pressure throughout southern Italy. Spartacus understood that his army's successful escape had only postponed, rather than resolved, the fundamental challenges facing the rebellion, while the arrival of Pompey's battle-hardened legions from Spain added a new dimension of urgency to the already critical military situation. The political dynamics in Rome had shifted dramatically as news of the breakout reached the Senate and created fresh concerns about the Republic's ability to suppress what had become the most serious internal threat in generations. The failure of Crassus's elaborate fortification system represented not merely a tactical setback, but a fundamental challenge to Roman military prestige that demanded immediate and decisive response. The appointment of additional commanders and the mobilization of fresh resources reflected the gravity with which Roman authorities now viewed the rebellion's continued existence. Pompey's return from his successful Spanish campaign brought approximately 20,000 veteran troops who possessed extensive experience in irregular warfare against opponents who employed unconventional tactics similar to those that had served the rebels so effectively. These legions had spent years fighting Sertorius's forces in terrain and conditions that closely paralleled the challenges presented by Spartacus's army, providing them with tactical knowledge and combat experience that previous Roman forces had lacked. The psychological impact of Pompey's reputation as an undefeated commander also created expectations of swift victory that increased pressure on all parties to seek decisive confrontation. The rivalry between Crassus and Pompey added personal and political dimensions to the military campaign that influenced strategic decisions and tactical approaches in ways that would prove crucial to the rebellion's ultimate fate. Both commanders recognized that credit for suppressing the revolt would significantly enhance the victor's political standing and future prospects, while failure would damage reputations that had been built through years of successful military service. This competition created pressure for aggressive action that might compromise the methodical approaches that had previously characterized Roman military operations. Crassus's response to Pompey's arrival reflected his understanding that time was working against his political interests, even as it continued to favor Roman military objectives. The praetor intensified his pursuit of the rebel army, while implementing tactical innovations designed to force decisive engagement before his rival could claim credit for ending the revolt. The systematic approach that had characterized his previous operations gave way to more aggressive tactics that prioritized speed and conclusive results over the careful preparation that had defined his earlier strategic planning. The rebel army that Crassus pursued through the mountainous terrain of southern Italy retained significant military capabilities despite the hardships endured during the winter siege. The successful breakout had restored confidence in Spartacus's leadership, while demonstrating that Roman military superiority was not absolute. creating renewed determination among fighters who had witnessed their commander's tactical brilliance overcome seemingly impossible odds. However, the rebels also understood that their strategic options remained severely limited, as they lacked the resources necessary for sustained operations while facing the combined pressure of multiple Roman armies converging on their position. The internal dynamics within the rebel leadership reflected the strain of their increasingly desperate situation, as different commanders developed conflicting strategies for addressing the challenges they faced. Some advocates argued for immediate attempts to break through Roman encirclement and escape to other regions where they might find refuge or support, while others proposed negotiated surrender that might secure better treatment than they could expect after military defeat. The unity of purpose that had sustained the rebellion through its period of greatest success began to fracture under pressure from circumstances that seemed to offer no viable path to victory or survival. Spartacus faced the monumental challenge of maintaining cohesion among his diverse followers while developing strategies that could address their deteriorating situation without abandoning the principles that had motivated their resistance. The winter breakout had demonstrated that dramatic action remained possible, but the fundamental strategic problems that had trapped the rebellion in southern Italy persisted despite their tactical success. The Thracian commander needed to balance the competing demands and expectations of his followers while preparing for what appeared to be the final confrontation with Roman forces. The fragmentation within rebel ranks intensified as reports reached the army about Roman troop movements that suggested the development of a comprehensive encirclement strategy designed to eliminate any possibility of escape. Intelligence gathered by rebel scouts indicated that Crassus was coordinating his movements with Pompey's advancing legions to create a massive pincer operation that would trap the rebel army between converging Roman forces. This tactical situation offered no viable alternatives except direct confrontation with superior enemies under conditions that would favour conventional Roman military advantages. The decision to march toward Apulia reflected Spartacus's recognition that continued retreat would only worsen their strategic position, while allowing Roman forces to choose the time and place of final confrontation. The Thracian commander's analysis indicated that accepting battle in terrain of his choosing offered better prospects than allowing the Romans to complete their encirclement and force engagement under even more disadvantageous circumstances. The mountainous regions of Apulia provided defensive opportunities that might offset Roman numerical superiority, while allowing the rebels to demonstrate their continued military effectiveness. The march eastward through the rugged landscape of southern Italy proceeded under increasingly difficult conditions as Roman cavalry units harassed the rebel columns while preventing access to supplies and reinforcements. The rebels' mobility, which had been one of their greatest tactical advantages throughout the rebellion's development, became compromised by the need to protect non-combatants and wounded fighters who slowed their movement while requiring resources that were increasingly scarce. The psychological pressure of constant pursuit created additional strain on fighters who understood that each day brought them closer to decisive confrontation with overwhelming odds. The final encampment established by the rebels in the hills of Apulia reflected both their continued organizational capabilities and the desperate nature of their situation. Spartacus positioned his forces on elevated terrain that provided defensive advantages while offering multiple escape routes if tactical circumstances required rapid withdrawal. The rebels constructed field fortifications, using techniques learned through months of successful military operations, creating defensive positions that maximized their limited resources while channeling potential Roman attacks into predetermined killing zones where rebel advantages in individual combat skills could be most effectively employed. The composition of the rebel army that prepared for final battle demonstrated the remarkable diversity that had characterized the movement throughout its development. Former gladiators formed the elite core of experienced fighters whose professional combat training made them formidable opponents in close-quarters fighting, while agricultural slaves and other recruits provided the numerical strength necessary to face Roman legions in conventional battle. Germanic and Gallic warriors contributed their specialized knowledge of cavalry tactics and siege warfare, creating a combined force that possessed capabilities rivaling those of professional Roman armies. The weapons and equipment available to the rebel forces reflected both their military successes and the limitations imposed by their irregular status. Captured Roman arms and armor equipped the majority of fighters, providing them with professional quality gear that matched or exceeded the equipment carried by their opponents. However, the rebels lacked the sophisticated supply networks and manufacturing capabilities that sustained Roman military operations, forcing them to rely on battlefield captures and improvised solutions for equipment maintenance and replacement. Crassus's approach to the final confrontation incorporated lessons learned from previous Roman defeats while exploiting the tactical advantages provided by superior numbers and logistical support. The praetor deployed his 8 legions in formations designed to maximize Roman strengths in coordinated infantry combat, while minimizing exposure to the irregular tactics that had served the rebels so effectively in previous engagements. The systematic approach that had characterized his campaign reflected both his understanding of rebel capabilities and his determination to achieve decisive victory that would eliminate any possibility of continued resistance. The Roman battle line that formed in the Apulian hills represented the culmination of months of careful preparation and tactical innovation, designed specifically to counter rebel advantages. Heavy infantry formations provided the core strength necessary to absorb rebel attacks while maintaining cohesion under pressure, supported by cavalry units that could exploit any gaps or weaknesses that developed in enemy positions. Auxiliary troops and missile weapons provided additional tactical flexibility, while specialized engineering units prepared siege equipment that could be employed against rebel fortifications if direct assault proved insufficient. The psychological warfare that preceded the final battle reflected both sides' understanding of the moral and political stakes involved in the confrontation. Roman commanders emphasized the restoration of order and the punishment of rebellion against legitimate authority, while rebel leaders stressed the fight for freedom and dignity that had motivated their resistance from its inception. The proximity of the opposing forces created opportunities for communication and negotiation that both sides explored while maintaining preparations for military action. The final battle erupted on a spring morning in 71 BCE when advance elements of both armies encountered each other in the broken terrain of the Apulian hills, triggering a general engagement that would determine the rebellion's ultimate fate. The initial contact occurred when Roman cavalry patrols, attempting to locate rebel positions, encountered screening forces that Spartacus had deployed to protect his main army's flanks. The skirmishing that developed from these chance encounters escalated rapidly as both commanders committed additional forces to support their engaged units. Spartacus personally led the rebel response to the Roman advance, demonstrating the leadership by example that had earned him the loyalty of fighters from diverse backgrounds throughout the rebellion's development. The Thracian commander's presence at the front of the battle line provided inspiration and tactical coordination that proved crucial during the intense fighting that characterized the engagement's opening phases. His combat skills, refined through years of gladiatorial training and tribal warfare, remained formidable despite the wounds and exhaustion accumulated during months of continuous campaigning. The rebel assault on Roman positions initially achieved significant success as experienced gladiators and former warriors exploited their superior individual fighting skills to break through sections of the legionary line. The ferocity and determination displayed by fighters who understood they were battling for their lives and freedom created psychological pressure that disrupted Roman formations and created opportunities for tactical exploitation. The rebels' knowledge of their opponent's equipment and tactics, gained through previous victories, allowed them to target specific vulnerabilities in Roman defensive arrangements. However, the fundamental advantages in numbers, equipment, and organisation that Roman forces possessed gradually began to assert themselves as the battle developed into a sustained confrontation. The disciplined coordination that characterised legionary combat proved effective against rebel attacks that relied primarily on individual prowess and small unit tactics. Roman reserves could be committed to reinforce threatened sections of their line while maintaining overall formation integrity, creating a tactical flexibility that the rebels could not match with their more limited resources. The turning point came when Roman cavalry units succeeded in outflanking rebel positions and attacking the rear areas where non-combatants and supplies were located. This tactical manoeuvre forced Spartacus to divert significant numbers of his best fighters from the main battle line to protect civilians and essential equipment, weakening his ability to maintain pressure on Roman positions while creating additional tactical complications. The rebels found themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, a situation that favoured Roman advantages in coordination and numerical superiority. The collapse of rebel resistance occurred with devastating swiftness once their tactical cohesion began to break down under the pressure of coordinated Roman attacks from multiple directions. The individual courage and fighting skills that had sustained rebel success throughout the rebellion proved insufficient to overcome the systematic advantages that professional Roman forces could bring to bear in conventional battle. The retreat that began in isolated sections of the rebel line spread rapidly as fighters recognized that continued resistance would result only in death without achieving meaningful tactical objectives. Spartacus died during the final phases of the battle, fighting desperately to rally his disintegrating forces while attempting to reach Crassus and eliminate the Roman commander in personal combat. Contemporary accounts describe the Thracian leader's final charge as a desperate attempt to decapitate Roman leadership and create opportunities for his surviving followers to escape the battlefield. His death in combat, surrounded by the bodies of his most loyal followers, marked the effective end of organised rebel resistance and the collapse of the most significant slave revolt in Roman history. The aftermath of the battle revealed the complete destruction of the rebel army as an organised military force, with thousands of fighters killed during the engagement and most survivors captured for punishment or re-enslavement. Roman casualties were relatively light, reflecting the tactical advantages that had enabled their victory despite the fierce resistance offered by desperate opponents. The battlefield carnage provided stark evidence of the rebellion's final failure and the futility of challenging Roman military supremacy through conventional confrontation. Crassus's treatment of captured rebels demonstrated the brutal efficiency that had characterized Roman responses to slave revolts throughout the Republic's history. Approximately 6,000 prisoners were crucified along the Appian Way between Capua and Rome, creating a horrific display designed to terrorize enslaved populations while demonstrating the consequences of rebellion against imperial authority. The crucifixions proceeded according to systematic schedules that maximized their psychological impact, while providing visible evidence of Roman power and determination to maintain social order. The crucifixion process itself reflected the calculated cruelty that Roman authorities employed to discourage future resistance among enslaved populations. The condemned rebels were nailed to wooden crosses and left to die slowly from exposure, dehydration, and eventual suffocation as their weakened bodies could no longer support their weight. The crosses were positioned along the major highway connecting southern Italy to Rome, ensuring that travellers would witness the gruesome spectacle and carry news of the rebels' fate throughout the empire. The hunt for surviving rebels continued for months after the main battle as Roman forces systematically searched the mountainous regions of southern Italy for scattered groups that had escaped the final confrontation. These mopping up operations employed the same methodical approach that had characterized Crassus's overall campaign, using local knowledge and systematic area searches to locate and eliminate any remaining centres of resistance. The captured survivors faced immediate execution or sale into slavery under conditions that ensured they would never again pose threats to Roman authority. The political consequences of the rebellion's suppression created lasting impacts on the careers and reputations of the commanders involved in the final campaign. Crassus received credit for the decisive victory that ended the revolt, enhancing his political standing while providing him with the military credentials necessary for future advancement. However, Pompey's arrival in time to claim credit for capturing some of the fleeing rebels created tensions that would influence their subsequent political relationship and contribute to the rivalries that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion's suppression saw significant changes in Roman slave management practices, as authorities recognized the need for reforms that would prevent future uprisings of similar scale and intensity. The concentration of large numbers of slaves in gladiatorial schools and agricultural estates was reduced through regulations that limited the size of individual holdings while requiring improved security measures. The treatment of gladiators received particular attention as officials understood that the specialized combat training that made them valuable entertainers also created the military capabilities that had enabled the rebellion's initial success. The economic disruption caused by the rebellion created lasting impacts on the agricultural systems of southern Italy, as the destruction of estates and the loss of enslaved workers required years of reconstruction and replacement. The regions that had served as battlefields during the rebellion's development suffered extensive damage to infrastructure and productive capacity that reduced their economic output for decades following the revolt's suppression. The costs of maintaining large military forces during the extended campaign also strained Roman financial resources and contributed to the fiscal pressures that would characterize the late Republic. The symbolic significance of Spartacus's rebellion extended far beyond its immediate military and political consequences to influence concepts of freedom and resistance that would resonate throughout subsequent history. The image of enslaved gladiators successfully challenging the might of the Roman Empire provided inspiration for later generations of oppressed peoples who sought to overthrow systems of exploitation and domination. The rebellion demonstrated that even the most powerful imperial systems contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by determined opponents with effective leadership and tactical innovation. The historical accounts of the rebellion that survived from ancient sources reflected both the Romans' need to understand how such a massive uprising had occurred and their desire to minimize its significance for imperial stability. Writers like Plutarch and Appian emphasized the exceptional circumstances that had enabled the rebellion's initial success, while arguing that such events were unlikely to recur under normal conditions. However, their detailed descriptions of rebel military capabilities and organizational achievements provided evidence of the sophisticated resistance that enslaved populations could mount when provided with effective leadership and favorable circumstances. The influence of Spartacus's rebellion on Roman military doctrine and imperial policy extended throughout the remaining centuries of Roman dominance as authorities implemented measures designed to prevent similar uprisings while maintaining the enslaved labor force that sustained imperial prosperity. The reforms in gladiatorial training and slave management reflected lessons learned from the rebellion's development, while the enhanced military presence in regions with large enslaved populations demonstrated the ongoing concern about potential resistance. The rebellion's legacy influenced Roman approaches to provincial administration and social control that would characterize imperial policy for generations. The cultural impact of the Spartacus rebellion transcended its immediate historical context to become a symbol of resistance against oppression that would inspire revolutionary movements throughout subsequent centuries. The story of escaped slaves successfully challenging imperial authority provided a powerful narrative that could be adapted to various struggles for freedom and social justice. From medieval peasant revolts to modern liberation movements, The example of Spartacus offered proof that seemingly powerless populations could organize effective resistance against overwhelming odds when motivated by the desire for freedom and dignity. The modern interpretation of Spartacus's rebellion has been shaped by changing political and social perspectives that have emphasized different aspects of the uprising's significance. Marxist historians have focused on the rebellion's class-based character and its challenge to economic systems based on exploitation, while liberal scholars have emphasized its contributions to concepts of individual freedom and human rights. These varying interpretations reflect the continuing relevance of the rebellion's themes, while demonstrating how historical events can acquire new meanings as social and political contexts evolve. The archaeological evidence that has emerged from sites associated with the rebellion has provided additional insights into the material conditions and organizational capabilities of the rebel forces. Excavations at gladiatorial schools and battle sites have revealed details about weapons, equipment, and living conditions that supplement the literary sources while providing more objective evidence about the rebellion's development. The physical remains of crucifixion victims along ancient Roman roads have provided grim confirmation of the brutal suppression that followed the rebellion's defeat. The enduring fascination with Spartacus's story reflects both its dramatic character and its fundamental themes of freedom, resistance, and the struggle for human dignity against systems of oppression. The rebellion's combination of military action, political organization, and moral purpose created a narrative that continues to resonate with audiences seeking inspiration for their own struggles against injustice. The transformation of a Thracian gladiator into the leader of the largest slave revolt in ancient history demonstrates the potential for individual courage and determination to challenge even the most powerful systems of domination. The ultimate failure of Spartacus's rebellion does not diminish its historical significance or its continuing influence on concepts of resistance and liberation. The rebels' achievements in organizing diverse populations, developing effective military capabilities, and maintaining resistance for nearly 3 years against the full might of the Roman Republic demonstrated possibilities that had previously seemed impossible. Their defeat resulted from the overwhelming resources that Rome could mobilize rather than any fundamental flaws in their organization or leadership, providing a model of resistance that would inspire future generations of oppressed peoples. The legacy of Spartacus and his followers lives on not in the territories they failed to conquer or the freedom they could not permanently secure, but in the enduring proof they provided that human dignity and the desire for freedom cannot be permanently suppressed by even the most powerful systems of oppression. Their rebellion stands as testament to the courage of ordinary people who chose to risk everything rather than accept lives of degradation and bondage, creating a legacy that continues to inspire those who struggle for justice and human rights in every age. The gladiator who broke his chains in a school at Capua had indeed achieved a form of immortality, not through military victory, but through the eternal power of his example to inspire hope in the hearts of the oppressed.